Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our March planning meeting. My name is Peter Clark. I'm the Vice Chairman of the Planning Committee. Our Chairman, Ruth Edwards, is still indisposed. She is making a recovery, and we trust she'll be back here for our April meeting. I'll introduce all the officers who are in front of you, so those of you who are watching live will recognise who we all are. On my right,
Councillor Roger Harris, Opposition Spokesperson.
John Rogers, Solicitor from the Legal Department.
Philip Thomas, Development Services Manager.
Mark Hand, Head of Planning, Housing and Place Shaping.
Richard Williams, Democratic Services.
Craig O'Connor, Development Management Area Manager.
Andrew Jones, Development Management Area Manager.
Shirley Wigham, Housing.
Louise Corbett, Housing.
thank you one and all. Can everybody please make sure that their mobile phones are switched off, please, because it interferes with our equipment in this room. The first item on the agenda this afternoon is apologies for absence. Richard?
Yes, Chair. Apologies from Councillors Howard and Edwards.
And Debbie Braper as well. Second item on the agenda is declarations of interest. Is anybody Alan?
Yes, thank you, Chair. The last time this item was discussed, I declared a personal and prejudicial interest because I'm a resident of Church Road in Caldicot, which may be directly affected by this development. So I shall be leaving the room when you carry out your discussion, and I'll be in the members' room. Thank you.
If any member of the public at the back of the room is here to hear the Trostry application this afternoon, it has been withdrawn from today's agenda, so I don't wish you to remain and listen to it all before we get there. I don't think there is anybody, but I'm just double checking in case there is. Yeah. Okay. Sorry? I've missed it. Anne?
I believe I have to declare an interest, Chairman, in 1635 as I'm on the board of Monmouthshire Housing.
Okay. Yeah, David? Mon Housing. Okay. I sit on a subsidiary board of Monmouth Housing. John, I don't think I have to declare for that, do I?
Thought that you were sufficiently removed from it. It's a matter for you if you're concerned.
I'm happy about it. Yeah. Next item on the agenda is to confirm the accuracy of the minutes held here a month ago on pages 1 to 8.
Prepared to move, Chairman.
Yeah. Councillor Brown?
Just a very slight amendment on page 5 at the bottom there. On the last sentence, it says, however, before issuing the decision, ensure details of house types, including overhanging eaves, sills and headers, are reviewed and agreed by the delegation panel. I believe that where it says ensure, in between the word ensure and details, it needs to actually say design details, because we did actually discuss in quite a bit of depth about design, not just those particular issues. So I think it was a bit broader than that, and I think the minutes should reflect that, if you agree, Chair. Thank you. Okay.
Mark, would you like to say anything about this particular one?
Yeah, Chair, just to give Planning Committee members an update on the application. As agreed at the meeting and minuted, those detailed aspects of design of the houses were reviewed. Amendments are coming, they're being agreed by delegation panel, so that application's been approved and that decision's issued. Obviously it's a matter for committee, but in terms of the minutes, I'd suggest that the word in there is sufficient. I think that the delegation panel was clear on what it was considering, and has duly done, but obviously it's a matter of members.
For the sake of one word, okay. Right. We've had the minutes moved. Are you all happy to approve the minutes of the last meeting with that amendment? Thank you very much. We go on now to consider the applications before us this afternoon. They are not necessarily in the order of the agenda because we have speakers on a lot of them this afternoon. The first one we're going to discuss this afternoon is application 00880, which are the 130 dwellings east of Church Road, Caldicot. Yeah, hold on a second.
Sorry, the monitoring officer has asked me just to say a few words before this application. Only to say that members should be looking at this application afresh, just as if it was a completely new application. You don't need to vote in the same way as you voted previously. You've got to keep an open mind, consider it today, and vote as you see fit today.
Thank you, John. Philip?
Okay. So this is the application for residential development at Church Road. Just to put it in context here, members will recall that this application was considered previously at the meeting held last November, but recognition of what John has just said is acknowledged and before you. The application was considered in the context of the Council's decision on the 20th of September 2018 regarding its strategic approach to addressing the authority's lack of a 5-year housing land supply and the Council's approach to unallocated housing sites, following Welsh Government's disapplication of paragraph 6.2 of Technical Advice Vote Note 1, TAN 1, in July 2018. The 20th September Council decision gave, to quote, appropriate weight to the lack of a 5-year housing land supply and agreed that applications for unallocated sites must be considered against 11 ground rules. Following November's Planning Committee meeting, the outline planning application was referred to Welsh Government under the terms of the Town and Country Planning Notification Wales Direction 2012, as it has to, given the scale of the proposal. Welsh Government considered that the Council had assessed the application against relevant national and local planning policy and had provided a reasoned conclusion for its decision. Welsh Government stated that the proposal was unlikely to have wide effects beyond the immediate locality and did not raise issues of national security or novel planning issues. Welsh Government stated that the decision should be taken by the local planning authority and should not be called in. Welsh Government also concluded that the Council as local planning authority had considered the relevant planning policies in coming to its decision, and it had considered the ways of working principles set out in the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, and those working principles had been satisfied. Having said that, as this is a fresh decision, if members are minded to approve the application today, subject to the Section 106 and conditions, the matter would have to be referred again to Welsh Government under that direction. Welsh Government noted that Cadw had not been consulted regarding the impact of the proposal on the setting of the Berries Mound and Bailey Castle scheduled monument. Cadw was consulted regarding the application by Welsh Government via the notification process, and Cadw considered that the impact on the setting of the scheduled monument was unlikely to be significant. Members will be aware that its strategic approach to unallocated sites was reconsidered by Council recently on the 21st of February to correct a data error in the 20th September report. The 21st of February report, more recent one, provided corrected data and also considered the strategic approach against updated national planning policy, namely Planning Policy Wales 10. Council resolved to give, again, appropriate weight to its lack of a 5-year housing land supply, insofar as those development proposals are otherwise acceptable in planning terms and subject to the 11 ground rules set out in that report. This application is therefore represented to committee in the light of the 21st of February 2019 Council decision, because the Planning Committee report from September 2018 duplicated the incorrect data regarding the LDP housing delivery shortfall against targets from the 20th September Council report. Sorry, I should have said from November 2018, when this was originally considered. This report corrects that error, and in addition, the application has been considered against the new version of Planning Policy Wales. So to look at this application again afresh, it's an outline application with all matters reserved except for access. It seeks permission for up to 130 dwellings, 35% of which would be affordable. The application site includes a proposed community park in the northern part of the site, other amenity open space and significant woodland areas. The main vehicular access would be from the existing residential area through Hill Sarawi, with smaller access from Clos Ystwyth. Provision could be made at some future date for a second main access into the south of the site from Hill Tyvey. The site measures just over 10 hectares and consists of 4 fields immediately to the northeast of the new housing development off Church Road. Let's just have a look at the photos. So the first slide, you see the public right-of-way, which is on the eastern side of the existing housing, and the site is over to the right-hand side. That's looking in, from the opposite direction over into the site. So the trees in the distance that form the break between this and the triple SI. That's looking back at the existing housing. This is one of the fields to be developed. And that's looking back down towards the belt of trees I mentioned before on the eastern and southern boundaries. That's looking back towards the existing housing. And again, a similar shot. Similar shot. That's the site in context, the red edge there. So it shows how the site bounds the eastern edge of the existing settlement off Church Road. That's an indicative master plan, which shows the red arrow shows the access off Hill Sarawi, with potential for a secondary access at the bottom end of the site, the southern end of the site, and shows the woodland areas and the eastern and southern edge of the site between it and the triple SI, and the potential community parkland, proposed community parkland in the northern part of the site with rights of way running through it. And that shows green infrastructure sort of planning there, which shows the pipeline that runs through the middle part of the site, which sterilises a large part of the site, but would be an opportunity for open space to be provided on its, along its length. So I'll leave it on this particular plan there. So the land generally slopes downwards from west to east, and the site is adjacent to the Nedden Brook wetland, which is designated as a site of special scientific interest, or triple SI, for its importance for overwintering and wading birds. To the south of the site is the Caldicot Country Park. A public right-of-way dissects the northern part of the site, and there are several mature hedges crossing the site, and the eastern boundary is formed by a wide woodland belt, as you can see in the slide. In terms of the principle of development, it's located outside the Caldicot development boundary in an area considered as open countryside, and as such its development for housing is a departure from the adopted development plan, and open countryside policies apply. Section 38(6) of the Planning Compulsory Purchase Act states that all planning applications shall be determined in accordance with the adopted development plan unless material considerations indicate otherwise. One of those material considerations is the council's housing land supply. There is a shortfall in the 5-year land supply in Monmouthshire, with the land supply currently at 3.9 years. Until July 2018, paragraph 6.2 of Technical Advice Note 1 required that when considering planning applications for housing development on land not allocated in an adopted LDP, considerable weight must be given to the lack of a 5-year housing land supply. And this meant that otherwise acceptable housing development would be approved even if it were not allocated for development in the LDP. Appeal decisions in this regard were consistent and clear. In July 2018, the Cabinet Secretary with responsibility for planning issued a consultation on a proposal to suspend paragraph 6.2 for an undetermined period while a review of housing supply is undertaken. The Cabinet Secretary has since issued her decision, or the Cabinet Secretary at the time issued her decision, which is to disapply paragraph 6.2. And the duration of this decision is unspecified. Her letter, however, goes on to state that it is now for the decision maker, i.e. in our case Monmouthshire County Council, as local planning authority, to decide the weight to give to its housing land supply shortfall. On the 20th of September 2018, the Council resolved that when considering planning applications for housing development on sites not allocated in the LDP, appropriate weight would be given to our lack of a 5-year housing land supply, and proposal would be assessed against 11 ground rules. Subsequently, the Raglan Village Action Group contacted the Council's Planning Department to raise concerns that data presented to Council on 20th of September setting out the housing delivery shortfall against LDP targets was incorrect. The 21st of February 2019 report to Council corrected that error, as well as reviewing the approach to unallocated sites in the light of updated national planning policy contained in PPW 10, which was not published until December 2018. The Council resolution agreed that consideration would follow a hybrid spatial model based on a balance between evidence of delayed site delivery, which shows the greatest shortfall is within the southern local housing market area, which includes Chepstow and Sevenside, and the LDP settlement hierarchy, which seeks to focus growth on the three main towns of Abergavenny, Chepstow and Monmouth, then Sevenside, then the rural secondary settlements of Llanfoist, Penpethlenny, Raglan and Usk. The Council resolved that consideration of unallocated sites would be subject to the following 11 ground rules. 1. Residential development is unacceptable in principle within undefended floodplain, Zone C2, or on greenfield sites within defended floodplain, Zone C1, as per national policy. 2. Residential development is unacceptable in principle within allocated green wedges. The appropriate time to review green wedge designations is via the new LDP. 3. Residential development is unacceptable in principle on allocated employment sites, and such sites will not be released for housing development unless full compliance with LDP policy E1 can be demonstrated, and there is no realistically likely future demand for the site for employment purposes. 4. Unallocated sites are required to deliver 35% affordable housing, and no negotiation will be entertained, although there would be 60% where the development relates to a main village. 5. The development must be acceptable in other planning terms. If infrastructure is inadequate to support new development and it cannot be satisfactorily improved via a planning agreement, permission would normally be refused. This includes matters such as highway capacity, school capacity, primary health care, air quality and the sustainable transport hierarchy as set out in PPW 10. This applies to all planning applications for residential development, not just unallocated sites. 6. The scale of additional residential development will be considered in the context of the LDP's spatial strategy, both in its right and cumulatively with other approved residential development. 7. Development should be restricted to the main towns, Sevenside and rural secondary settlements, with the exception of Llanfoist and Raglan, where there should be no additional development on unallocated sites outside of the new LDP, although that is caveated as set out in the report in Raglan's case. And small 60% affordable housing sites in those main villages without an allocated site, namely, in this case, St Arvans and Llandogo. 8. The size and mix of the proposed dwellings is both suitable for the location and seeks to address our demographic challenges. 9. Any planning permissions will have a reduced lifespan, as set out in the report. 10. Applications recommended for approval shall be accompanied by a unilateral undertaking or a signed Section 106 agreement by the time they're presented to committee. And 11. All of the ground rules cease to have effect should we regain a 5-year land supply and or meet the LDP housing shortfall identified in the report. So in this context, with regard to the ground rules agreed by Council, under Ground Rule 1, a small part of the site, but not the developable area, is in a C2 flood zone. No dwellings or roads would be located within the flood zone. 2, the site is not designated as a green wedge. 3, the site is not allocated as an employment site. 4, the development would provide 35% affordable housing, which is policy compliant and not subject to viability testing. Based on 130 dwellings, which is the maximum that could be built, the site would provide 46 affordable dwellings, or 45 if the requested adapted bungalow is provided. 5, the site is acceptable in planning terms for new housing development and is in a sustainable location within easy walking distance of the town centre, shops, medical facilities, schools, amenity sites and community facilities. The site also has good access to local bus and train services. Aside from the fact that the site is not allocated within the LDP, it meets all other policy objectives, and this is considered further in the remainder of the report. 6, the scale of the proposed development, that is up to 130 dwellings, is considered to be proportionate in the context of the scale of Caldicot, a town of approximately 4,350 homes, and it's also considered acceptable in the context of other approved and allocated residential development in the Sevenside area. 7, as already stated, the application site is located within Sevenside, so this ground rule is complied with. 8, the size and mix of the proposed dwellings and their effect on tackling our demographic challenges and their suitability for the location will be considered reserve matters detailed planning stage should this outline application be approved. And 9, should Planning Committee be minded to grant planning permission, a reduced lifespan will be required in terms of submission of reserve matters within a year and then commencement within 1 year of approval of reserve matters. 10, this application is accompanied by, is subject to a section 106, which sets out agreed heads of terms, and the update report is that that's very close to agreement in terms of our respective legal teams. And 11, neither the identified housing delivery shortfall by the end of the LD period, plan period, nor the housing land supply shortfall have been addressed to date, and so the Council's decision of the 21st of February remains in place. And in respect of affordable housing provision, the developers have now agreed that 35% will be provided and that this will not be subject to a viability assessment. This is set out in the planning agreement and is in accordance with the ground rules. In relation to education provision, the proposed development would provide a maximum of 85 open market houses based on the overall 130 unit element. And this figure has been used to predict the demand for school places required in the area as a result of this development. It is predicted that this development will result in a shortfall of 20 primary school places in the Caldicot catchment area, although the exact number will be determined by the number of houses put forward in the reserve matters. But the contribution will be in the region of £17,000 for each extra school place required. And this will be secured through the planning agreement. This money will be used to provide extra school places in the most expedient locations to ensure that there are sufficient school places to accommodate the children forecast to be living in the new development. In terms of health provision, as agreed with members in 2017, the Aneurin Bevan Health Board is consulted on all major residential planning applications. The number of GPs in an area is based on population. The Health Board have confirmed that GP provision within the area is at capacity. However, in this particular case, the local GP surgery is confirmed it can accommodate an additional GP without needing to actually extend the surgery building or its car park, and consequently no Section 106 contribution is sought in this instance. As regards transportation and traffic, the site sits in a sustainable location close to local facilities in the town centre. The proposal shows that there will be one main access into the new housing development, and this will be from the recently adopted Hill Sarawi and would serve up to 120 of the new dwellings. There would also be 2 vehicular accesses off Clos Ystwyth, each serving approximately 5 dwellings, although this would be dependent on the reserve matters layout proposed. The capacity of the local road network to accommodate the additional traffic generated by the proposal has been considered, especially with reference to Church Road, Hill Trothy, Hill Sarawi and Clos Ystwyth. The transport assessment concluded that the development can adequately be served along those roads without detriment to the local road network, and that those roads do have sufficient capacity to accommodate the new development. Highways colleagues concur with this, stating that the roads will operate within capacity after the development is completed and that there is no need for any improvement or mitigation. While it is agreed that the new development can be safely served by one main vehicular access into the site, the local area would benefit from 2 means of accesses into the site thus promoting permeability, facilitating alternative routes of travel in and out of the development, emergency access, and potentially providing a through route for public transport. It is for this reason that a clause has been put into the planning agreement requiring that the developers provide the opportunity for the new development to link up to Hywel Teifi over land outside the ownership and control of the applicant. In respect of surface water drainage, sustainable drainage systems to reduce surface water runoff and minimise its contribution to flood risk elsewhere are proposed. As with the recently completed site adjacent, the existing houses, the use of SUDs can control the rate at which the surface water enters the Nedden Brook and its catchment area, thereby reducing the risk of flooding. The details of the surface water drainage will need to be provided as part of the Reserve Matters application, as its nature and location will be dependent on the layout of the site and vice versa. NRW are satisfied with this approach and have requested a condition requiring that details of the foul and surface water drainage are provided. There is a high pressure gas main running through the middle of the site, and there will be a green space over this area with 15 metres retained either side of the pipeline at which no houses would be constructed. This conforms to the health and safety executive requirements and will also provide a green wildlife corridor through the centre of the site. In respect of flooding, NRW have no objection to the proposal on flood grounds given that no new development is proposed on the land liable to flooding. During the construction phase of the development, the land may be compacted and this may alter the drainage on the land, and it's important that this is addressed as part of the drainage details to be submitted with the Reserve Matters. The two small areas identified as being at risk of flooding on the overall site will probably continue to flood during the winter months, but the proposed development will not exacerbate this situation. NRW identify the main issues affecting the SSSI are the disturbance of birds from dog walkers and the water quality of the Nedden Brook. The ecological appraisal submitted by the applicants considers how to avoid and mitigate these disturbance pressures. These include the creation of the community park away from the SSSI and interpretation boards advertising local walks and directing recreational activities away from the designated site. NRW are satisfied that provided that the measures set out in the ecological appraisal are implemented fully, the proposal will not have a significant impact on the SSSI. In addition to the interpretation boards, NRW advise that notice boards are produced to educate homeowners and potential dog walkers of the disturbance they could cause to wintering birds. And some local residents have expressed concern regarding the loss of the application site for dog walkers and those wishing to use a public right-of-way to walk in the countryside that will result in walkers being forced to walk in the SSSI, causing harm to the wildlife. Although the public right-of-way through the site would be retained, albeit likely diverted to follow some of the road network through the site, it is acknowledged that this section would no longer be a countryside route. However, as part of this application, the applicant is providing almost 3 hectares of open space in the northern part of the site away from the SSSI to be made available to the public as a community park. And there would also be almost another hectare of woodland with public access. Extensive green infrastructure is being provided on the site, which is important given its edge of settlement location close to the SSSI and Country Park. A financial contribution of £25,000 will be required for the installation of informal play equipment in the proposed community park. In addition, there would be a requirement for a commuted sum of well in excess of £200,000 for the maintenance of the community park over a 20-year period. A sum of over £1,500 per market dwelling would also be required to provide or improve off-site recreational facilities. And this contribution could be used to fund various facilities or projects in the Caldicot area, such as the Caldicot Greenway scheme, or to improve Caldicot Castle Country Park, and so on. In respect of landscape impact, the proposed development will be located on the edge of an existing settlement adjacent to the recently completed housing developments. The application site is not set in isolated country away from any other form of built development. In fact, it relates well to the existing settlement form. The detailed layout and design of the proposal will form part of the reserve matter submission, but with careful design, the development will have no unacceptable adverse impact on landscape, historic, cultural or geological or heritage, biodiversity or local amenity assets. In relation to amenity, many of the properties along Clossest with Hill Sarawi and Hill Glaslyn have their rear gardens abutting the development boundary. When designing the layout for the reserve matters, consideration must be given to maintaining privacy distances between the existing and the proposed dwellings. It would also be ensured at that stage that the proposed dwellings will not have an overbearing impact on the amenity of the occupiers of the existing properties. And there are 2 public footpaths crossing the site, and these are both currently well used. The majority of the existing footpath length is in the area of the proposed country park, and the alignment would not be affected by the housing development. But part of one footpath does cross the developable area, and its alignment may have to be altered as a result of the detailed layout of the housing site. Given the amount of green open space proposed for the site and the fact that there will be several green corridors running through the site, there will still be plenty of scope to have the footpath separated from vehicular traffic and to provide a pleasant link through the development. The exact position of this footpath will be determined with the reserve matters, and if necessary, a diversion order will be required. Finally, you'll be glad to know, since the previous report, PPW 10 has been published. This requires proposals to be assessed against a sustainable transport hierarchy. The hierarchy's aim is to prioritise walking and cycling, followed by public transport and ultra-low emission vehicles ahead of other private motor vehicles. PPW confirms that new development should aim to create walkable neighbourhoods where a range of facilities are within walking distance of most residents and the streets are safe, comfortable and enjoyable to walk and cycle. The sustainable location of this site on the edge of the town, the spaces proposed across the site and the permeable nature of the proposed development will fulfil this policy requirement and will ensure the future occupiers of the site have the opportunity to access local facilities and employment via foot, cycling or public transport with less reliance on the private car. So we'd recommend approval of the application subject to the Section 106 agreement, which includes affordable housing funding, the education contribution, green infrastructure contributions and green transport funding, as well as the planning conditions set out in the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil, for that very detailed presentation. Would the local member now wish to address the Planning Committee? Councillor Watkins, please. Joe, you have 6 minutes.
I'm here to represent the views of my residents who have written to me relating to the proposed development off Church Road in Caldecott. For completeness, I need to say a very small number of residents contacted me in support of the proposal, one in terms of the affordable housing element as they were on the waiting list themselves, and the other stating they hoped increasing the size of Caldecott might help regenerate the town centre. However, the vast majority of residents have opposed the scheme for a myriad of reasons. I will now list the reasons directly presented to me, but then highlight the ones that I believe as a planning committee you should consider most strongly. There were many concerns about the infrastructure in Caldecott. The doctor's surgery has long waiting times and it's almost impossible to get an NHS dentist, which leads to higher prices for private dentists. The schools are at capacity. I know an Iron Bevan Health Board has stated that there are issues with recruitment and rather than building space, but that is no consolation to any of my elderly residents who struggle to get an appointment. Schools are covered by the Section 106 arrangement, but I challenge this council. Caldecott schools are already full. We cannot wait for the houses to be occupied and we get the 106 funds before we build the extra school places that we require, or we will have a ridiculous situation in which we are busing our children from one town to the next, and it will create an ongoing problem. Concerns have been raised with me about the archaeological remains found in the Nedden Rise and whether more will actually be discovered on this site. There is also big concerns about the increased traffic flow that could impact on air quality, which is a problem throughout our county in some of the more built-up areas, and that might cause damage to the Roman ruins in Caerwent. The site contains a public right-of-way, which is used by ramblers and the local community. Although the site will retain the right-of-way, it will no longer be an attractive country walk, as it will be through a housing estate. And there are concerns that this will then push the walkers into the SSSI, which could have a negative effect on the wildlife. NRW has stated they wish to deter walkers, especially dog walkers, from the SSSI while the birds are overwintering there. Concerns have been made that this development will mean people will choose to walk in the countryside rather than stick to the right-of-way. All of you on the committee will have heard me speak in full council about the grave concerns I have about road safety on Church Road, especially at school drop-off and pick-up times. An increase in traffic on Church Road will exacerbate an already dangerous situation. Another road safety concern is having the main entrance of the site being through Hoyle Saroe and Hoyle Trothy. These are very small estate roads with lots of children playing on the streets. There is a high-pressure gas main through the site, and there are concerns about how this site is then developed, with recent incidents on the site causing residents a great deal of stress and concern. There's also concerns about the increased strain on the roads around Caldicot and the surrounding areas, potentially leading to an increased strain on all of those commuting routes, especially now the 7 bridge tolls have gone. Noise pollution from the M48 will also potentially become an increasing problem if the tree barrier is reduced. Several people have also expressed concern about increased flooding risks in the castle grounds that could actually end up reaching Hale Typhy down the bottom. The primary area of concern has been the proximity of this proposed development to the ecology of the SSSI. The site is valuable to overwintering birds, bats and insects, in particular the hornet robberfly, which requires a very particular environment which is found on this site. As I previously stated, this SSSI ought not to be heavily walked, especially during winter months, and is a valuable and rare resource. In permitting a development so close to the SSSI, there are concerns this could set a dangerous precedent. I'd like to point members to the recent reports on the massive decline in global insect populations. Over 40% of the world's insects are facing extinction. We all read the reports and think it's shocking. We wonder how life will carry on if we destroy our food chain. And yet, how many of us consider that it's also our responsibility when we make such decisions as this one? An insect's habitat is threatened. Insects are not as cute as giant pandas or orangutans, and we're happy to condemn other countries for palm oil plantations causing deforestation. So my plea is that this site goes into a future round for the LDP. We are going through that process already now, where it can be considered in the light of all of the developments that we are planning to make in the rest of the county. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have Mr. Richard Rees to speak next, please. Sorry, Mr. Richard Rice. Mr. Rice, you have 4 minutes.
Yes, good afternoon, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me to speak on behalf of the overwhelming number of Caldicot residents opposed to this application. We are here once more because there was a major error in the supported evidence concerning the availability of affordable housing. This was an MCC error that was not picked up by either MCC or the speculative developer who knows full well the system and how the numbers for affordable housing are calculated. This error was identified by a member of the public. The evidence that was relied upon to justify your original decision to approve in November has changed significantly. The last time you voted, you made your decision based on incorrect data that showed a shortfall in housing availability, particularly affordable housing. The shortfall is now significantly less. According to your own targets, it is in fact 38. We require an answer why these incorrect numbers and developments were able to go unnoticed and have been used to justify a departure from the LDP. How could MCC lose track of the numbers? Why should we now rely on any evidence put forward? The Church Road development is outside of the LDP, a development brought forward by a speculative developer whose sole motivation is profit. The residents of both Church Road and indeed Raglan, both areas outside of the LDP, have had to act as oversight and throughout this process have identified the errors in data and statements. To ensure that there are no other errors, we feel this matter should go forward to the next LDP and go through proper, considered and validated process and scrutiny to ensure all correct facts are known. Only then will we have confidence in this process. You have stated in past meetings and in supporting documents that the 45 affordable homes included in this development are non-negotiable. What guarantees do you have that the proposed 45 homes will be handed over? Are there any penalties for failing to deliver? That said, how many developments inside the LDP have achieved the target on affordable homes? The question needs to be answered urgently and put in the public domain. A similar question regarding 5 key sites was asked by Councillor Watts at the February Council meeting, as yet we have no answer. We know that the large Sudbrook development will only achieve 9%. Why not 25%? Sudbrook was in the LDP and is a brownfield site. If you had achieved the full 25% on that development, you would have met your target based on the corrected data now in front of you. Why are MCC not holding the developers of that site accountable for failing to deliver? Another question that needs to be answered. You were laying down the quotas. You asked for 35% or 25% and then agreed to a low percentage when the developer cries not viable. How can this possibly be allowed to happen? There should be penalties. What is the point of a commitment if it is allowed to be watered down and challenged? The consequence of this mismanagement is that you've had to approve further developments to make up your numbers. There are both environmental and financial costs associated with this course of action. MCC justification for this development is based on affordable housing without due regard for the local overstretched infrastructure or SSSI. Safety has also recently become a major concern. Wales and West Utilities were not given advance notice of work being done at the site, which contains a high-pressure gas line. This is critical to public safety. The residents know the rules. Why is the developer already riding roughshod over the rules? A sign of what we can be expected in the future. It is well known that previous Church Road developments have not delivered on all that they said would deliver at this stage in the process. It begs the question, has this developer fully delivered on previous commitments? We are not naive enough to believe it will be any different this time. In summing up, your decision must now be based on fact linked to the revised evidence, not emotion or other agenda. Otherwise, you will leave this process open to further challenge, which is the reason why we're back here today. This development should be rejected and put forward to the next LDP for full and considered appraisal on all facts, as there have been many errors found so far in trying to rush this application through the process without proper oversight. You cannot keep approving developments in the hope you will get enough yield to meet your affordable homes. MCC must correct this in the next LDP. The principal reasons for allowing this departure from the LDP have been shown to be flawed and therefore invalid, and that the original decision should now be reversed, as there is no justification for allowing this development. An overwhelming number of residents, Caldicot and Cowent councils are against this development, and as our appointed representatives, I would ask you to respect these objections and reject this application for the valid reasons mentioned today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rice. Mr. Heffer, would you like to address the Council's Planning Committee? You also have 4 minutes.
Thank you, sir. Roger Heifer, the planning consultant responsible for this planning application. Members, you've just heard points which I respect, but frankly, all points which have been made many times before over the roughly 10 months since this planning application was submitted. They've all been very thoroughly assessed by your officers, and your officers have concluded that, on balance, the planning application should be recommended for approval. As you will be aware, this committee resolved to approve in November. In my view, the case now is even stronger than it was then. We now have the new PPW 10, which sets out some very strong guidance on how sites for development should be selected and how they should be planned and developed. And this scheme is very much in accordance with that advice, as the officer's report spells out in some detail. As far as housing numbers are concerned, we know there was an error in certain of the numbers. But the fact is that you still have a serious deficiency in terms of 5-year supply. I think it's still something like 3.5 years, 3.6 years. Rather more importantly, the economic and social needs of the county which are impacted by that deficiency are very much unchanged. You still face the prospect of a serious shortfall in delivery by the end of the current local plan period. And the need for affordable housing is as great as it ever was. So, in my view, there is certainly no improvement in terms of the housing supply and delivery situation. If anything, it's even more acute than it was in November. You'll have seen from the committee report that your officers conclude that this is a, and I quote, well-considered and sustainable scheme expected to create a distinctive place, fostering social cohesion and the well-being of its residents. You've heard also that it passes all 11 of this committee's, or rather the council's, ground rules, and you've heard also that it's been to Welsh Government, who have said that they're entirely happy with it. My submission is that there is an overwhelming planning logic to this land being developed. It's always been intended that it should as the conclusion of the expansion of this northeastern side of Caldicot. You've heard the suggestion that everything should be put on hold pending a review or the next review of the LDS. I would suggest that's completely pointless because the logic of development has been very thoroughly assessed already. And if today you resolve again to grant permission, you can expect delivery to start to happen really quite quickly and the planning benefits of that delivery equally to start arising very quickly. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Heaver. Yes, yeah. Mark Hands now wishes to address us.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I've got some correspondence from the Town Council to make members aware of because they're not here to address you. So two bits of correspondence. The first one reiterating the points from Councillor Oliver Edwards, who attended the meeting in November. The short version is that the Town Council stance remains unchanged. But the comments to highlight to you are that the Caldicot Town Council supports the need for affordable housing. However, the Town Council refused the application when it came before them for the following reasons. The proposed development is outside of the LDP. There's insufficient infrastructure. There's a lack of primary school places in the Caldicot area. The doctor's surgery will struggle due to increased numbers of patients, not just from this development, but from developments in Crick, Sudbrook, Mager and Undy. And Church Road is the main road that traverses Kywent and into the town centre, so additional traffic will cause a bottleneck, especially due to school during school opening and closing times, causing a risk to children's safety. I've also got correspondence from Councillor Rachel Garrick from the Town Councillor that I've agreed to read out if you're in agreement, Chair. So Councillor Garrick says she's one of the Town Councillors for Caldicot Castle Ward. As we're all aware, committee, the application for the Church Road housing development is due at Planning Committee today. There appears to have been an oversight in that the Town Council did not receive any formal notification that the application's back on the agenda for planning. As a result, the Town Council has missed the opportunity to formally nominate a councillor to address the planning meeting on behalf of the council and residents. Town Council previously objected to this development. Would it be possible to provide this email to the meeting as late correspondence? Hence reading out now. As a Town Council ward councillor for the area, residents have raised concerns with me, Councillor Garrick, on the development. Many concerns focus on transport issues in and around Church Road at peak times. I'm particularly concerned about this in the light of the recent upheaval in Chepstow, where additional planning is desperately needed to alleviate congestion. At the moment, Church Road is heavily congested during peak time and has similar geographic features to Chepstow in that the surrounding hill creates a basin which is in effect a sink for pollution. Much of the congestion focuses on school pick-up and drop-off times, and the congestion will affect young children who are particularly susceptible to air pollution. The concern has also been expressed about the safety of children who currently play and cycle in the local housing estate, which will become a through route for the new developments. This concern is particularly high as there does not seem to be a fully formed plan for an alternative access route to the development. Further concerns are being raised by residents on environmental factors, with genuine worry that building work will affect the species present in the adjacent site of special scientific interest. There is concern the tree screen that is proposed may be far from adequate and will take many years to reach maturity to actually provide the break needed between the development and the SSSI to perfect its habitat, by which time it will be too late. There are additional concerns running along the pollution potential for the Netherm Brook, which has previously been affected by large housing developments. While I appreciate there will be no direct discharge into this body of water from the proposed houses, there is a concern that a development will affect the area's ability to drain, and that washings from activities such as car washing and window washing will ultimately pollute the Netherm. I'm also concerned about the potential for construction discharges under any construction water discharge permits being able to affect this local body of water. Concerns have been raised by local residents who use the public right-of-way for recreational purposes and feel this will be changed and devalued as part of the development. Significant concern has been raised by residents over the presence of the high-pressure gas line running through the development. Having worked in construction, electricity and utilities industries for around 20 years, I'm very familiar with the realities of utility strikes in construction work. Striking a high-pressure gas line would be potentially devastating to the local community in terms of danger to life. While safe systems of work will exist, a busy building site will inevitably suffer some utility strikes, and this is a very real safety risk. The Town Council objected to the development based on a lack of planning for schools. The Town Council is aware of the County Council's plan to raise around £1.6 million for education contributions from local developments across 7 sites. However, no plans exist for an additional primary school, and the proposals are that places will be created in already spaced compromised local schools. A proposal to extend the capacity of the local faith school as a principal solution to general requirements is not acceptable to many families who wish the children to either pursue other religions or enjoy a largely secular education, and should not be the main solution to the dearth of education places. It should also be noted that some of the schools in Caldicot have now slipped to amber ratings, including the school located in the ward, and that an approach of cramming more children into the oversubscribed schools is not the way to improve education. Many thanks, Councillor Rachel Garrick.
Thank you very much. We made a site visit there yesterday. Does anybody wish to comment? Councillor Powell.
Thank you, Chairman. I've heard everything that's been said, and I sympathise with a lot of it. But historically, I come from the Abergavenny area, and we had quite a big building and estate in Llanfoist, and the same things were said then. But in actual fact, a good proportion of the young families coming into those houses aren't from away. They're local people who have been living possibly with families in cramped conditions, waiting for somewhere to buy, or living in rented accommodation, hoping that they can have a house. So they're not always a great deal of extra children coming in. There are children who have been in the area, but who need to have houses. And I think that I don't know what the numbers are. Perhaps somebody does know what the numbers are in that case. But I think that is needs thinking about, because we want to look after our local young people who live in the area and who want to have houses, just as much as we're trying to get people in from outside. I don't think we're trying to get people from outside. We need to look after our young people, because so many of them are never going to get their foot on the step to get into the housing otherwise. And I think this needs to be taken in consideration. Okay.
Thank you. Councillor Murphy.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And yes, I've got a great deal of sympathy for some of the arguments that I've heard. I really think they must pick up on a couple of things. So I have said, I think I said at the previous meeting, that you don't have to wait for the money to come in to make improvements to schools. You can borrow against it. So any improvements to school buildings or extra capacity that needs to be built in can be done in preparation for the demands on the system, which of course are not just this site. The other aspect is with regards to the point that Councillor Powell made about the need to create the opportunities for young people to get onto the housing ladder. There was a point made too about the viability of sites impacting on the amount of affordable housing. As I understand it, this particular site, apart from the gas main, and you can see there that there is a very clear corridor to allow the gas main to go through. There should be no abnormals on this site. The Sudbrook site that was mentioned had an incredible amount of additional site clearance fees, and that did cut into the amount of affordable housing that was available. The error, as it's being called, well, it was an error, let's face it, in the calculations has reduced the amount of shortfall, but I do take the point that there is still a substantial shortfall on the houses being built, despite the fact that we've given planning permission for an awful lot of them. The amount of affordables in amongst that are still lower than they ought to be. And of course there is the matter, as the last speaker said, about the lack of the 5-year housing supply. That leaves us wide open to other sites coming in that we have no control over. I don't believe that waiting for the LDP is going to achieve anything. It's only just going to put it off for a couple of years, in my opinion, and that is my own opinion. So regretfully, I know this is not what the objectors are going to want to hear, but having read all of this again in some detail, I haven't seen anything that actually changes my mind. And I'd be prepared to propose that we confirm our agreement to the proposals.
Thank you. Councillor Higginson.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. I've heard it all before, I have to say, many, many years ago. I can remember the time when no one in Caldicot wanted houses to the northeastern side of that roundabout, at the junction of Taft Road, at all. And developments are taking place there, and in actual fact, excellent developments. And you know, extending further on up that road. And every time there's been a development proposed, and I well remember Caldicot Town Council opposing each of them. But every time a development has gone on up there, there's always been a protest. And in fact, the people who live in some of the houses now that were protested about years ago, I mean, they are saying enough is enough, or we can't, we know we don't need any more. The fact is, as Councillor Murphy said, first of all, we do need more houses, and this particular site now will see it all wrapped up. There won't be any more in that area. But the other side of it is that the affordable element, we desperately need them. And I mean, I can remember when there's best part of 4,000 on waiting for houses in the Sevenside area, and that's not all that many years ago. Fortunately enough, it's down now to, whilst it might not be an acceptable number, it is considerably less. It's less than half of what I believe it was of what it was some time ago. So I don't have any problem with this, because I just could say this, and I spoke to the planning officer some time ago, but I can go back quite a way. And I can remember in the late 80s when there was, you know, there was uproar, if you like, about developing that site up there from that roundabout up the roundabout bottom of Taft Road, and a planning inspector said, you will develop that ground. They will put houses there. And that's a long time ago. And I appreciate the planning officers who are in situ now don't know anything about it. But in fact, I think it was before this council come into being. and I've been a councillor since 1983. That's about 13 years before this council started. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Brown.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I mean, I do appreciate the need for affordable housing that we've got, but I am concerned about the issue of infrastructure, and that is actually one of the ground rules that we look at in terms of infrastructure. It's things like roads, air quality, health services, and so forth. And I think that my concern is on the transport side, there's a tendency to look at just the surrounding roads, whereas in this particular area, we need to look at basically the corridor between Lydney and Gloucestershire and Caldicot, because it all impacts Chepstow in relation to the traffic that go to the motorway that commute to Bristol. And I think that we've got a very short-sighted vision of infrastructure, and I would certainly like that to be examined further. The other concern I've got about infrastructure is in relation to the difficulty of local people in obtaining appointments with their GP. Now, you'll see if you look at page 26 of the previous report that in the pre-application submission there was expressed concern about this, and then later on there was a sort of an optimistic response. Now, this application was considered previously in November 2018, and I don't believe, unless planning officers can provide the evidence, that there's been an update on this. Sorry, my voice is croaking a bit. An update on this particular issue, because in my ward recently there has been a letter dated the 23rd of January just in relation to surgeries, and it says the practice has applied for development of the Portskeworth branch surgery and are concerned about capacity at the main surgery in Chepstow pending that development, as there's no room for further staff to be cited. So although that's in the Portskeworth area, it's a symptom of problems in this general Caldicot Portskeworth area in relation to surgeries, and I don't know whether or not any further response has been sought from the Health Board, because we've been advised to look at this application totally afresh, and one of the ground rules is infrastructure. And I think that this is an issue obviously in relation to the removal of the tolls and the increase in general traffic in the area, and a consideration about air pollution issues, which is a material consideration in planning terms. So I welcome the development from the point of view of the affordable housing element, but I would prefer to see this type of application looked at in the LDP, so that we can look at the infrastructure of the roads across this particular area and look at the cumulative impact, because I think some of the comments on the previous application said that there was no joined up thinking about this, and I don't think there is any joined up thinking, because we look at the small areas of roads around the development, but we don't look at actually where the traffic is actually going, and I think this needs to be properly considered, and I think this is something that an LDP does better than effectively unallocated sites, which is the one that we've got in this particular aspect. So I think that is the concern I've got, and also the cumulative impact, as I said previously, in relation to this application of these sites all over the place that do generally add up. Thank you.
To Councillor Higginson.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. I appreciate you giving me the opportunity. Caldicot surgery, you can go there 8 o'clock tomorrow morning and you can get an appointment tomorrow. If I go there this afternoon and I want to look for an appointment, I'll have to wait a couple of weeks. No argument about it. But if you were concerned, if your well-being is obviously a personal concern, you can go there in the morning. Admittedly, you have to join the queue, but you can get an appointment that day, and I think that's important. And I congratulate the Caldicot Surgery on introducing this, because it makes a heck of a difference to the people in Caldicot.
Thank you.
Sorry, could I interject on that? Because I think he's talking about urgent as opposed to routine appointments. Thank you.
Louis, oi, shush, fair of you. Right, mark hands, please.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. There's a couple of points raised there that are probably worth coming back to. One is around the road infrastructure. Comments made in the November meeting, if you recall, about the very same issue were concerned from Councillor Brown that sites are only looked at in terms of the nearest T-junction, if you like, or the immediate roads, not the wider picture. And I explained at the time then that isn't the case. I feel that those comments do colleagues in the Highways Department a disservice. And we're arranging that seminar to clarify that in the future. But they do look at the bigger picture, and they do look at the cumulative impact of other consented or LDP schemes that are coming forward, even if not yet built. So they will have looked, if you remember the last meeting, we're looking at how traffic from here might go through might go through Pulmeric and Chepstow. So those wider issues are considered. In terms of primary healthcare facilities, there is no change on that front. We haven't gone back and reconsulted. But if members recall and look in the report, the Health Board has actually said that there is a capacity concern, but the solution to that is by expanding the local GP surgery. With an extra GP, that doesn't require the building to be physically extended or the car park to be extended. So there's no requirement for Section 106 contributions, but the solution to that lies with the Health Board, and they're addressing that with the GP surgery. So it's not disputed that there's a capacity concern, but the Health Board's explained how they'll address that themselves. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Right, we've had the application moved for approval by Councillor Murphy. Is that seconded? Yeah. Councillor Powell. All those in favour of this application, please show. And those against, please show. 1. Okay, the application has been approved. Thank you.
1 abstention.
1 abstention. Can I just make one point, please, Mr. Han? Yeah. The application is adjacent to what I consider to be one of the best developments we've got in Monmouthshire. It's very, very tidy, it's well designed, and I trust that this present applicant will follow the quality that is there already. This is not a detailed application, this is just an outline, but I think he should know from our notes that we will look very carefully at the design when it comes forward.
Okay, noted. Thanks, Chair. Just for completeness, Chair, to confirm what Phil mentioned at the beginning, just to be certain in terms of the process, we'll make Welsh Government aware of this, and they'll have the opportunity to call it in again, because this is a fresh decision today. So we'll go through that process and tell you the outcome. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much.
Better go and get Hannah.
Yeah. Right, we carry... David. We'll carry on now to the next application, which is on page 57. It's number 00894. It's at Hatcham Barn, Court William Jones, Monmouth.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, this application is for the conversion of existing outbuilding into two 3-bedroom dwelling houses. The application is outlined on red on the screen at the moment. It's an outbuilding which is in association with St James's House, which is a Grade 2 listed building. So this building is actually within the curtilage of that property, and therefore it is curtilage listed as well. If you go to the next, this is a plan showing the elevations and the plan of the building. So it's a stone building, metal roof, and as members seen yesterday, if you go to the next picture, Phil, members were on site yesterday, they've seen the building. It's a stone building in association with St James's House at the front there, in the rear of the photograph. If you go to the next photo, Phil, this is photos from inside the site. It's a single-storey building, and it's been adapted over the years in terms of some modern additions to it. That's an internal photograph of the building. So you can see, again, traditional stone walls and the metal roof being propped up. This is an existing site plan of the site. You can see the application site outlined in red. So it includes the barn, the tree, area of land to the east and to the west where the garden is. So this site actually has planning consent. It is historical, and members of the last planning committee will be aware of the site. It has got planning consent that can be converted to one dwelling for a 4-bedroom property. This was as part of a bigger development to convert St James's House and some of the other buildings there from a previous educational use into a residential use. So there is planning history to this site. It has got consent to be a dwelling, and this would increase it to 2 buildings. So we go to the proposal. This is the proposed site plan. So this shows how the site would be subdivided, the building would be subdivided into 2 dwellings. It also allows for an extension, which you can see there to the west, which would be a timber extension, which would be accessed via a glass link, which we'll come to when we see the elevations. But on this plan, you can also show the parking. So there's 2 parking spaces per property.
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry to interrupt the flow, but the gentleman is not using the microphone. I have, well, at least it doesn't appear to be on.
It is on, but it doesn't have a red light.
Well, I can't see it, but okay. But because he's not speaking into the microphone, my hearing is poor, and I'm not actually being able to hear clearly what is being said.
I apologise for that. I'll speak as much as I can. Is it here? Or?
Yes, okay. You'll give me a minute.
Certainly.
Could I take this opportunity to say that
No.
the photograph that you were shown...
Sorry, sir, you cannot speak at the moment. Your opportunity will come in due course. Please carry on, Mr. O'Connor.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair. So this is a proposed site plan, which does show the proposed parking to the east of the site, and then also the extension, which is accessed via the glass link, which we'll come on to now. If you go to the next picture, please, Phil. So this is an internal ground floor plan showing how our building would be subdivided, and it also shows the link there for the extension, which is the glass link for the dining room and for the kitchen area. Go to the next picture. This is the elevation detail for the proposal. So as you can see, the stone building would actually be extended vertically with a timber extension, which would be timber louvs and stone wall to the base of the building, and then have a metal corrugated roof with roof lights. If you go to the next picture, so this shows the extension which is proposed to the west of the building. As you can see, there's a glass link and a single-storey timber extension which would accommodate the kitchen area. Go to the next picture. This shows the north and south elevations in terms of noting that there'd be no windows in those elevations on each end. The roof of the building would be extended up to 7.2 to the ridge and 4 metres to the eaves. So the proposed this is just showing some of the images of where they've done the other development. So in the top left photo, you can see the timber louvs. So this is what's going to be created on top of that historical structure. Example of a type of glass link that would be constructed. So in terms of the extension measures about 10 metres by 7.9 metres, and it measures about 5.45 metres to the ridge. The proposed development has been designed with the heritage officer in mind. They've been involved with the planning application, and they have a subsequent concurrent listed building consent application as well. So they've been working with the applicants to ensure that we get a contemporary modern design on a historic heritage asset. So it's been done quite sympathetically in line with what the heritage officer is requiring. In terms of the parking for the site, as I said, if you go back to the site plan, please, Philip. There are 2 parking spaces per dwelling. They're 3-bedroom dwellings which are proposed. Monmouthshire's parking guidelines does say that we should be aiming for 1 parking space per bedroom. So this is slightly not meeting that requirement. However, this is a sustainable location within a central location of Monmouth, and therefore, on balance, planning officers are of the mind that the 2 parking spaces per dwelling in this instance, in this context, is acceptable. The contemporary extension to the building is considered to be sympathetic to the heritage asset, and the proposed materials and overall design is considered to be acceptable. In terms of consultation process, Monmouth Town Council were consulted on the application and have recommended approval subject to conditions outlined in the report. The Heritage Officer, as I've already mentioned, has been deeply involved in the design and the scale and the development overall, and the scheme has been amended. Sorry, I should mention this previously, but the original roof was higher than has been presented today, so it was 0.6 metres higher, has been reduced to overcome concerns with the neighbouring party and to ensure the design is right for this particular building. So the Heritage Officer is supportive of the application. In terms of Monmouthshire's highway officers, they have reviewed the site, and this would the site would be accessed off a private road, and it's unlikely, and they have concluded it's unlikely that any displacement will occur, and have raised no objections to the proposed development. There have been 5 objections to the proposed development, and these are all outlined within the report. Concerns over the proposed design approach that has been made for this heritage asset, concerns over the parking provision, and concerns over the impact this development will have on neighbouring properties. As I've already outlined, the proposed development is considered to be of a high standard design, and is in line with placemaking and ensuring that we retain our heritage assets in accordance with the requirements of PPW 10, Section 6. In terms of the impact it's going to have on the amenity of the local residents, as I said, there's a planning history to this site, and there is a extant planning consent for this to be converted for residential use. This would increase the amount of the properties on the site. However, the amount of windows and the impact that the development would have is not considered to be unacceptable. It's not considered that this development would have an unacceptable impact on any party's privacy, nor would it be overbearing. The proposed parking, as I've mentioned, is considered to be acceptable in this location, and for this reason, and for the reasons I've mentioned, the application is recommended for approval, subject to a Section 106 agreement being signed for the affordable contribution of £25,000 if the development is not brought forward as a self-build. So the application is recommended for approval, subject to the conditions outlined in the report. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Councillor Feekins, this is your ward. Do you wish to address the committee? You can do it at other place.
As opposed to commenting on the application? Right. Public speaking first, is it? Could I come back in after the public speaking?
Yeah. Do we have Mr. Rogers in the board? Yes. Yep, that's true. You have 4 minutes, Mr. Rogers, to address us.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I'm here to speak as a resident in opposition to this particular application. You will have read the report, members, and it's been reiterated just now by the officer that it seems that pretty well the whole of the report is predicated on the principle of how it compares with the application as it stood prior to some tweaking of it by the applicant. That's a comparison which doesn't take into account the existing site, nor does it take into account the existing planning permission. The permission that has been mentioned was part of the overall redevelopment of the Haberdashers boarding houses, one of which I happen to now occupy, which is St James's House. The existing planning permission is for a 4-bed barn conversion, but like in every instance, it did have an additional entirely new building at the rear, which was dropped prior to consideration by this committee. What's happened now with the present application is that this development, by raising the roof and increasing the usable floor area on a first floor level, and by inserting an additional extension at the rear, you have pretty well returned to the very permission which you didn't consider but would have refused. The rise of the building has been achieved by a set of louver wooden framework below the gutter line, i.e. raising the gutter line, and as a consequence raising the ridge height. Behind the louvers there is actually a series of windows which, contrary to what the officer just said about overlooking, does not actually isn't actually properly considered by the report. The officers make a great play of the fact that they have been able to offer to you a building which has no windows on the gable end, actually to the rear of number 11. What they don't take into account that there are a series of windows which will be reopened on the flank of the building, which is partially adjacent to my rear garden. Above that, we will have a series of additional windows behind the Louvre, which can't be seen, and in fact, in my view, create an impression of a secret overlooking which you are not aware of. The thing is that this has a detrimental effect on the whole of the rear garden of St James's House. The report also makes light of the shortfall in parking on the site. We have a situation where the existing permission allowed sufficient parking for a 4-bedroom property. This was important to members of this committee when it considered the total redevelopment of the area, of the Haberdashers' properties, which were boarding houses, and all the properties, as they were being considered, had to meet the very minimum basic parking standard. Now you've abandoned that in this report.
Mr. Rogers, you have reached your 4 minutes. If you could wind up for us
Yes,
now,
I
please.
will. I will finally say that, in fact, you've got a situation where there is already parking used on the rear of the property by the current owners who are making this application. They live across St James's Square. Their two cars will have to go back onto St James's Square, as these new properties are not sufficient to meet their requirements, and there is no ability for any of that parking to be accommodated on the access road to the almshouses, which is a very narrow road and has double yellow lines on both sides. I therefore ask the committee to reject this proposal as it stands. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rogers. Councillor Feakins.
Thank you, Chair. I've just heard everything Mr. Rogers has mentioned, and I think a large element of the design issues are subjective, whether you do or don't like this type of development. I don't think we can look at the scheme in isolation. This development has come forward to us as part of a scheme previously that was refused and then accepted. This barn itself came forward as a conversion of a building to a dwelling use for a four-bedroom dwelling, 1 times 4-bedroom dwelling. The permitted development rights were removed at that time. Other people have bought into this scheme, and other people bought into this scheme expecting that barn to be developed as was permitted at that time. There was lots of issues around this development previously, around the road, around the access, and largely around the set-in. Whether those have been or haven't been addressed, like I say, is largely subjective. All of the history and back history, I think, has to be read in conjunction with what's before us today, as much as we are now considering what's before us today. For me personally, I think we have to consider this as a new development, and as a new development, I think we should be considering the affordable housing contribution element that it's coming forward. The housing officer recommended or looked at and considered this to come forward as a proposal for 2 new dwellings. I hear the planning officer's report and can read that in as much as that there has been a planning permission granted for the barn to be converted into a 4-bed dwelling. What's before us today is not that conversion. What's before us today is a much higher building, much higher conversion, and a conversion that's twice the footprint. It's not the same development. It's twice the development as was before us. I think personally we should be looking at this as a new development, not as an extension of the existing extant planning permission. And I think that would be only fair. In the design and access statement, it's proposed that this would be brought forward as a self-build and would look to sidestep the policy of providing provision for affordable housing commuted sum. For me, that sticks in the throat for such a large development to come forward at this stage, which is looking and attempting and has been very open at this stage, saying we are looking to sidestep this as a self-build. This council, I am quite sure, did not come up with a policy of self-build in order for people to develop 2 houses side by side so that they could avoid paying affordable housing contribution. To me, that's completely wrong. If a self-build development comes forward, it should come forward for a single dwelling. That's the purpose, I believe, and was the history and the origin of that self-build policy. I don't believe it should be coming forward for 2 dwellings. So for me personally, I think that the design is subjective. I think the transport statement has been considered, and I think the issue of parking has been considered also. And all of those things I'm fairly comfortable with and moderately comfortable with. The issue of affordable housing, I'm not. I think that this should go back. It should be deferred on the basis that the affordable housing officer has considered this for two affordable housing contributions. I believe the what's before us today is so significantly different to the extant permission, which basically is half or if not a quarter of what's proposed before us today, that we should be going back to the applicant, and if it's accepted in planning terms, we should be asking for 2 lots of affordable housing contribution. And so for that, I'd propose that we defer this before us today.
Thank you. Mrs. Wigham, do you wish to address that? Or? Okay. Mr. O'Connor?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, this application should be seen as a new application. It is a new development. There is planning history, which is a material planning consideration when looking at this application. So the application before members today is a new application. You should be looking at it fresh, and you should be looking at it as that development. But however, in terms of the affordable housing contribution, there is a extant planning consent which could be implemented tomorrow for the 4-bedroom house to go there, which would not be subject to any affordable housing contribution. So in terms of officers looking at this application, we're looking at the net increase, which is for 1 dwelling over and above what has been previously approved. So that is the aspect of the development which is subject to the affordable housing contribution. So that has been reviewed as part of this planning application, and that is what is being sought from the development. In terms of self-build, I mean, if that is an exception within Monmouthshire's County Council's policy. If it is a self-build development, and then there is an exemption there from any affordable housing contribution, and that there is a clause in there that if after the person who built it and did the self-build would have to live there for 3 years. So after that, then if they did move within those 3 years, then there'd be a clawback to get that financial contribution from the applicant.
Councillor Feakins.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you for allowing me to come back. Thank you very much, Craig, for clarifying some of those issues. On a point of further clarity, if you've got 2 houses or 2 barn conversions being built side by side, what we're saying is you can live in the one that we're going to propose you're going to pay affordable housing on. Therefore, you can remove your obligation for affordable housing, and the one you're not going to pay affordable housing on, you can get away with. There's a technicality. There's a technicality there which we're being blindsided by a little bit, I think.
Yeah, Mr. Connor.
With that particular, I appreciate what you're saying. I think if it was another site which didn't have any previous planning history, the point is that this has got a previous planning consent, so it is exempt from affordable housing because that policy wasn't in place at that time. So a 4-bedroom house could be built there now.
Okay.
And just very, very quickly, thank you very much, Joe. I really do appreciate that. What I would say is that what was previously approved, people have been accepting of. We're putting more blight into that area. If we're putting more blight into that area, we as a council, we as the community should be looking to get more out of that area. That's my thinking. What was previously approved is so far removed from what is being proposed today that I can't see, and I don't believe that whilst an element of it has extant planning permission, this scheme doesn't have extant planning permission. A quarter of the ground space might have extant planning permission, or a third, or whatever that element is, but it's so considerably different to what's being presented to us today that I feel very uncomfortable with saying that we're looking at simply eroding the affordable housing contribution from that one unit.
Councillor Brown.
Yeah, I mean, I think my concern is the parking issue, because it's obviously clear that it doesn't meet the parking policy, and I don't know whether or not, you know, because we have referred to the previous permission, whether a 4-bedroomed property, I mean, how many were, I mean, presumably there were 3 parking spaces allowed for that, because it's a space per bedroom and a maximum of 3. But obviously, in terms of one family living there in a 4-bedroomed property, there will probably be a lot less issues of over parking there. So my concern about this particular development is the parking issue, because it's double yellow lines all the way round, and I don't believe that there's sufficient parking for this. So I think, I mean, I don't know, perhaps you could tell me whether the 4-bedroomed property on its own had better parking. Thank you.
The 4-bedroom property had 3 parking spaces in the same location, but it was just 3 spaces rather than 4.
You've put a quandary into the minds of a few of us, Matt. Yeah, do you want to come back or not?
I just reinforced, I would like to propose that we defer this to see if we can seek any more affordable housing contribution.
Okay. Have we a seconder for that? Councillor Webb.
I wanted to talk prior to the motion that you were trying to produce. I really sympathise with Matt's views about this development that is planned to go ahead here. There is something about the spirit of this development that is really totally at odds with the spirit of the development that is there at the moment. I remember with the people, the haberdashers, they went to a great lengths to make sure that that development fitted into the character of Monmouth in all its facets. It considered not only the aesthetic, but also what Monmouth stood for. And I think that there is something about this development that I don't think is right. It has a feeling about it that there are issues, and I think Matt has exposed them. And I think that we really need to sit back and think about it again, as you rightly said, Chairman. It's made a number of us think differently. Having debated it here today, I feel differently about the development to what I did when I went there and looked and listened to the presentation. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. To my mind, all of the issues are straightforward, apart from the affordable housing question that Councillor Feakins has raised. So I think Craig's covered off the points. We're satisfied in terms of impact on neighbour, in terms of amenity, but you've heard what Mr. Rogers got to say and his concerns, and you'll have seen on one of the slides how this property relates to the others. And then parking, straightforward in terms of sustainable location. Planning Policy Wales Edition 10 is very clear on us not having strict parking policies in that kind of circumstance, and there is amenity space for cycles and the like, so that works. Design-wise, I think comments have been made about it being subjective, but it's a conversion, but oddly it's in an urban setting in a town. If it weren't for the listing scenario, then you could knock it down and build new build. It's only because it's a listed curtilage building it's being converted in this way. But we as officers were very happy with the design. So it's the affordable housing question. So that is the dilemma we're trying to think through. So there's the one extant consent for a 4-bed conversion. The regs, our policy is clear, and it comes from the SIL regulations, which are clear about self-builds being exempt from that policy. So that's where we've taken that from. I think I'm right in saying your concern then, Councillor Feakins, is almost doubling up on the freebie on the exemption. So the reality would be, I'm just trying to think this through out loud, we'd be highly unlikely to get 2 contributions anyway, because one would be a self-build. There's 2 units there, so one would be a self-build. So we would only get 1 contribution. So yeah, I think it's worth us having to think through how that can work.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Chair. Would a unilateral undertaking be useful in that situation? In effect, there's a gap in our policy that we have at the moment that they could convert the one and then still claim the self-build allowance on the second by living in the second but converting the one free market. To me, that stinks a little bit. Not stink, but it's just something that's happened by 2 policies marrying together. But if we were to ask for a unilateral undertaking, maybe we would secure that position in advance, if that was possible. Or defer it and leave it to you.
Yeah, Chair, sorry, we're just discussing if there's a way in which we could merge the extant consent / self-build provision, so there is still that 1 contribution. I'm not sure how we'd arrange that in terms of a legal agreement, but I expect there is a way. So yeah, if members are minded, it could be to defer for that issue. It would help us so if there's clarity on the other issues, if you're satisfied, but want to defer it just for that one matter to be addressed.
So it's been moved and seconded by Matt and seconded by Councillor Webb. Sorry, Phil.
So only just a point, Chair. In view of the fact that everybody seems to be happy but everything else, I put happy in inverted commas because if that is the only outstanding point, it could be referred to the delegated panel to decide after. It's only a thought.
I thought it's quite a strong point coming here, and I think maybe the 3 of us, it leaves us a bit susceptible to criticism. I think I prefer on this instance, Phil, to see it come back here, because I'm interested in the outcome. So it's been moved and seconded that we defer it for a month, well, this matter of the contribution is resolved. Is that what you want to do? All those in favour, please show. Right, okay, there we are. Nobody against? No. Right, it's taken us an hour and 40 minutes to do 3 applications, so I think we ought to speed up. The next one on the list is so we go on to page 89 now. Oh, I see. No, you're quite right. Page 73, application 1339 of Penny Park, Lantilio
Yep, thank you, Chair. So this is a full application that relates to a parcel of land on the edge of Lantilio Cresceni that is accessed directly off the B4233. It's worth noting that the application is presented to Planning Committee today as the agent is a close family relative of a member of the development management team. Before going into the details of the application, I think it's worth familiarising members with the background and history to the site. Planning permission, DC 2014-00161, was granted in 2014 for the conversion of a redundant building to provide holiday let accommodation. The application at the time was supported by a structural survey that was undertaken in November 2013 that concluded that the property was suitable for conversion. Works then commenced in December 2016. However, the building had deteriorated since the original survey, and further to inclement weather in January 2017, the applicant sought advice from a health and safety specialist. Measures were undertaken to stabilise the building. However, it is advised that owing to the continued concerns for site workers and also potentially trespassers, that the building was therefore dismantled in February of 2017 due to health and safety concerns. Original building fabrics were retained. As the building had been dismantled, it was no longer possible to convert, and therefore the planning permission from 2014 could not be implemented. Accordingly, this application now seeks permission to reconstruct the building as per the original planning permission. A number of the members would have seen the site yesterday, but if you just quickly run through the site photographs. So that's perhaps not that clear. Phil, if you can just... So this, members, was the building as it previously stood at the time of the 2014 application. I believe there's another photograph as well, just showing the building in its original form. And the next slide just confirms its location there, adjacent to the B4233. So the site itself is within the Lantilio Cresceni Conservation Area and also lies entirely within Zone C2 floodplain. The building now proposed would follow the same form and appearance of the previous approval, as well as the same access and parking arrangements. The buildings would be finished as per the original with vertical timber boarding and felt roof shingles. So in terms of considerations of the application now before members, there are a number of important material considerations. Firstly, in terms of policy principle, Policy T2 of the LDP, which relates to visitor accommodation outside settlements, where self-catering visitor accommodation will only be permitted if it consists of the reuse and adaptation of existing buildings. Since the building that was to be converted is no longer present, then the application fails to meet the criteria of Policy T2 of the LDP and is therefore considered new build development in the open countryside. In addition to other criteria of that policy, the site is not ancillary to an existing medium or large hotel. Where Policy T2 does detail some exceptions, the proposal will also fail to meet these, as it does not relate to agricultural diversification, and with regards to exception criteria B and C, the proposal as detailed no longer relates to a conversion. Therefore, whilst it's noted that the dismantling of the building was necessitated by reasons outside of the applicant's control, and officers are sympathetic to this, there are no material reasons why this would outweigh the fact that the proposal is now for new build holiday accommodation, which is clearly contrary to both local and national planning policy. In terms of flooding, I mentioned earlier that the site lies entirely within Zone C2. Welsh Government's Technical Advice Note TAN 15, and in particular paragraph 6.2, is pretty clear that and explicit in it says highly vulnerable development should not be permitted within Zone C2, and tourist accommodation residential would fall within highly vulnerable development. Officers do acknowledge that there has been no change to the flood mapping since the original approval in 2014, which at the time also was cited within Zone C2. A flood risk and modelling survey has been undertaken in support of the application, and although no flooding has taken place on this site in living memory, the stream position is approximately 1.5 to 2 metres below the developable part of the site, and there is a man-made bund that runs along part of the site. The full flood modelling survey shows there would be no flood on the site, even in the most extreme conditions. The Council's statutory consultee on flooding matters is NRW, who have reviewed the information and have offered no objections. Therefore, whilst the 2014 application was not refused on this ground, advice from Welsh Government and the Planning Inspectorate since that time is clear and consistent and has been borne out in a number of appeal decisions, certainly for tourism uses. Members may remember Hadnock Road, Hotel, Dixon Fields camping site, that it is clear that highly vulnerable development should not be allowed within Zone C2. Therefore, the proposal does not satisfy the criteria in TAN 15 and therefore considered unacceptable. In conclusion, the particular circumstances of the application are noted and are somewhat unusual. However, as stated, officers are also sympathetic to the reasons that led to the original building having to be dismantled. However, having regard to the previous approval and all other material planning considerations, these are not considered to outweigh the two fundamental local and national planning policy issues. The proposal is now for new build tourist accommodation in the open countryside and sited entirely within flood zone C2. Therefore, for the two reasons detailed in the officer's report, the application is presented to members with a recommendation for refusal.
Thank you, Andrew. Mr. Smith, do you wish to address the council? You two have 4 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman, for allowing me to speak, first of all, and thank you, Planning Committee, for listening to me. I'm going to repeat some of the things that have been said by the officer because I think the context of this is very important. Planning approval was granted in 2014 for this conversion. In December 2016, work commenced. Gales, poor weather, etc., destabilised the building, and the applicant got a construction health and safety specialist to visit the site. And as a result of that, he took a range of measures to try and ensure that the building was saved. So the officer's report describes the building as having been demolished. It wasn't demolished, it was dismantled for health and safety reasons. And for those reasons, this occurrence was an act of God. It was a force majeure, if you want to use legal terms, in terms of the loss of the building. There was no intent on behalf of the applicant to remove that building. Now, appeals and case law in situations like this exists because although this is not a regular occurrence, it does occur at sometimes and has been subject of decisions in the past. And there are material considerations today, members, that I think you can take into account in considering what has happened here. First of all, you can consider the intent of the applicant and the outcome of development. Now, the intent of the applicant throughout this has been to implement the consent. He didn't take the building down or demolish the building with an intention to do something else. So his intention was clear. He purchased internal frames at a cost of £10,500, over £10,000, which can only be used in this building. They're in storage at the moment. If planning permission isn't granted today, they're on the scrap heap. He met the unexpected costs to retain the building. He put aquapops in, he got scaffolding in, he got a range of things in to try and save the building, but that was impossible. In the end, for health and safety reasons, as the officers pointed out, he had to take it down. You can take into account today financial reasons as well. This has cost the applicant £160,000 to date. That was raised by remortgaging part of his property, and he's servicing a debt on that of £6,400. So that is a material consideration. You can consider that, members. Finally, I come to force majeure or act of God, as I mentioned earlier, or special circumstances. That again can be a mitigatory factor in terms of determining this planning application. You can consider that. You consider the circumstances here that affected the applicant. In terms of flooding, well, we were quite shocked to get the reason on the planning application on the agenda. We took pre-application advice on this, and this wasn't brought up at all. It's come out of the blue. As the officers said, it's essentially circumstances haven't changed since 2016. So although the policy issues that the officer mentioned exist, I would ask you members to consider the material considerations that I've put to you in advance of this and say that they don't apply in this situation given what happened to the applicant. The neighbours' objections are set out in the...
Mr Smith, I've reached your 4 minutes. You can wind up now.
I can wind up now, yeah. I'll conclude now, Chairman. I'll conclude. The building wasn't demolished. Its demise was an act of God. The applicant took every measure he could to try and save that building. The applicant's intention has always been and remains to implement the consent that was granted. In terms of the flood issues, I think I've covered those sufficiently. So members, you're urged to approve this on the basis of considering the application against those material considerations, which I believe you can apply to this current planning application. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. We haven't got, no. Yes, Councillor Higginson.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Yeah, we were there yesterday, and we saw what what the position is, and it was explained it is on a floodplain. But I think that can be circumvented, if I put it that way. We had a situation in Carligott where there's a housing development proposed, and because there's, this is for just to say that how things can be organised to circumvent these issues. That was on a floodplain, and the ground level was raised. And as a consequence of the ground level being raised, there's a number of houses, in fact, housing association houses, and it's quite. Just making the point, what was pretty much a rundown area because it's an old school and that, but it's now an attractive area in which to live. So, okay, that was on the floodplain, and given that situation, it's not something that cannot be, addressed. And I mean, yesterday, we just not many yards from there, we looked at another site which is be coming up shortly. So I don't have an issue with that because I don't think there's no overlook situation. It's just of any property, and I think a property could be built in that area. Admittedly, that the ground level will have to be raised, in my view, slightly to accommodate what was recorded as or reported as a flooding area. But as the officer said, there's never been any flooding problem there. So if it did happen, by raising it up, I don't know, a metre or something of that nature, there's no reason why it couldn't be built upon, and I'm prepared to propose we accept it on the basis that conditions
Councillor Webb?
Yes, basically I was going to say what exactly Councillor Higginson has said. But I'm right, aren't I, in thinking that for many, many years there's been a building on this site anyway, going back for a long, long time. I would second Councillor Higginson's proposal. But I'm concerned again that sorry to hear this old thing, the Community Council haven't responded. They've had since August to respond and they haven't responded. So they're obviously not that interested in what's happening in their locality. Thank you.
Councillor Brown?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Yeah, I tend to agree here with the officer's recommendation, because effectively it's a now there's only the foundation left. Then effectively it's a new build in the open countryside, and it's also on flood zone C2, and it is very, very close to the brook, and it will be on the same footprint as well. And, you know, so from that point of view, and it will be used as tourist and residential type of accommodation. And, you know, we've already heard about the issue in relation to describe for one reason or another why the original building isn't there, you know, because of it being in a very open type of location, whether it's storm or flood or whatever. So it isn't actually in the best of locations for this type of thing. So for that reason, and for the reasons set out on 6.1, I would won't be supporting the I'll be supporting the officer's recommendation here. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Murphy?
No, Matt
Sorry? All right, sorry. Councillor Feakins?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Roger. I think the one of the issues on refusal regarding it being in the floodplain, but we have already granted permission previously in that same location, so there's a little odd thing there going in my mind. But more significantly, at what point does a building that's been destroyed by storm damage, is there a time limit at which that building would have to be rebuilt in order for it not to be considered a new building? There must be a point in law there somewhere about when a building falls down or is taken down or something else, or was taken down during a redevelopment or a refurbishment. When does it become, or when is it suddenly a new development? That's a point in law which I'd be quite interested to investigate a little bit further, if that's okay.
Yeah, Chair. In terms of a couple of the comments that have been made, I think I'm right in saying I'm trying to guess which other example Councillor Higginson's talking about, but I'm pretty certain it's a brownfield site within flood zone C1, so protected floodplain, and policies allow for development on brownfield C1. Policies are very clear in not allowing highly vulnerable development in C2, as Andrew set out. So while, as Andrew said, while we accept it was given consent in 2014, the stance that the Welsh Government's taking to TAN 15 and flooding policy has been clarified to us. As some members recall, I can only think of one particular case in very, very exceptional circumstances we've gone against that, and that was a relation in Troy House and the listed building and benefits of trying to save that. In terms of Councillor Feakin's question about the case law, the one that springs to mind is actually around listed buildings and when is an alteration to a listed building versus demolition, the Shimizu case, and that allows you to demolish quite a lot as an alteration, but that isn't really the question here. The stance we would take is there is no building on this site, it's just a footing, so there is no building to convert. It is a hard line, we appreciate that, but there is scope for that to be repeated in numerous other circumstances if we're not careful. So, you know, we have looked at this with slightly heavy hearts. We are mindful that there was a consent there that's now lost, and that has implications for the applicant financially and otherwise. And to be frank, there's not very many options for the site because of its floodplain location. But that is, you know, I agree with the recommendation. I do think it's the right one. It's regrettable for the applicant, but that is why we've come to that recommendation. Thanks, Chair.
Councillor Feakins?
Just to come up at a very point then, it's interesting to note that we mention there are footings left on site. And yet, if you put down footings on a new development, we're considering that building work has commenced. It would be, again, an interesting thing to know in law as to whether or not the demolition of this building, leaving the footings in place, means that there is an existing extant permission, as opposed to a new development, bearing in mind that there are footings in place.
Yeah, I think this case is more straightforward than a normal clarification about when it's building a building, because this is conversion. There is nothing to convert. It's just a slab of concrete. So there's nothing to paint or nail together.
Okay. Councillor Murphy?
Yes, Chair, I wanted to pick up on the foundations as well. I mean, Councillor Higginson was trying to rescue the situation, I think, by saying that if we could raise it up, we could possibly get it out of the flood zone. The applicant's clearly looking to build on the existing footings, which are quite substantial. There would be quite a lot of expense to add to his woes, and I have great sympathy with the financial situation, but I don't see how that relates to a planning decision at all, I'm afraid. But there would be considerable expense to raise it above that C2 limit, and I've got grave doubts as to whether an inspectorate would approve it even then. So to pick up on Mark Hand's comment, with a heavy heart, because I've got a great deal of sympathy for him, I shall be supporting the refusal.
Thank you, Chair. I think in common with most of the members here, I'm very sympathetic to the situation that the applicant finds themselves in. But at the end of the day, as a planning committee, we must abide by planning law and take the advice, I think, of the officers concerned. What we don't want is this application being rejected by us and then going somewhere and being told that we've made the wrong decision when it's clear that the policy says that this is now a new development. And whilst I sympathise very much with the applicant, as far as I'm concerned, I support what the officers are saying, and that we should not approve this application. Thank you.
Roger?
Yep. Thank you, Chair. Yes, it is a dilemma, this case, but we've heard what the officers have said, and things have changed since 2014 or 2016 when things started falling down, and we've been told that as it stands at the moment, as far as the officers are concerned, it's a new build in the open countryside and it's in a C2 floodplain. We need to take notice of what the officers are saying, and the important thing here is if we go along with what the officers are saying, it's not the end of the road for the applicant. He will have a right of appeal, and the officers have put forward a good case, and unfortunately I can't see a reason for not supporting the officers.
Thank you, Rod. Right. Would somebody like to? Councillor Higginson.
Yeah, I propose that we accept it, and there are circumstances in which the site could be used for housing development or development of residential property, and I'm maintaining my proposal.
Okay, and is that seconded?
Yes.
And well, right, those people who would like to approve it, please show. 3, 4. And those against, please show. 5. Therefore, and I'm abstaining, so therefore I'm afraid it is lost. Whoops, with a very heavy heart. Right, the next application has been withdrawn, so we go on to page 109 now, and that's for the barn conversion into holiday accommodation at Penterry, St Albans. Okay. Mr O'Connor.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, this application is at Penterry Farm, Chapel Hill Road in St Albans. and it's for the conversion of a barn to holiday accommodation. So on the screen here, members would have seen yesterday, this is the barn in question. It's a modern agricultural building, breeze block, steel framed, some timber cladding. There's, if you go back to the previous photo, please, Phil, sorry. That road on the side there, that is actually a public right-of-way, so members need to take note of that, and as you did yesterday on site. I'd like to go through the... keep going, please, Phil. So some photos of the building. It's a standard agricultural building which you'd find across Monmouthshire. This is the siting of the agricultural buildings, which is adjacent to 2 residential properties, the barn to the north and a bungalow to the south. And in this location, it is those group of buildings to the north. Yeah. This is again a block plan of the site. This is the proposed site plan, so this shows the access points on either side of the proposed holiday accommodation and the parking provision for 2 spaces per unit. This is the existing floor plan and elevations of the building. And then this is the proposal then, so the proposed alterations to the building to make it into the holiday accommodation. So you've got timber cladding, fenestration details, the timbered openings, which would be put onto the site. So as you can see, it's a modern agricultural building. The application is to propose to convert it for a highly vulnerable form of residential use for holiday accommodation. The site lies within the Wye Valley area of outstanding natural beauty, and there is a public right-of-way running alongside it, so it is visually prominent within the area. The proposal is to convert it into 2 4-bedroom holiday lets, and is to be Yorkshire boarded and to have a metal-clad roof with, which would be, and the building would be goosewing grey in colour. As outlined in the report, the application is being recommended for, the officer's recommendation is to refuse the planning application. Policy T2, which deals with the conversion of buildings in the open countryside for tourism use, outlines that the building should be suitable for residential conversion, and we would look to more traditional stone buildings and buildings which are capable of taking that residential use. And the policy doesn't allow for any the conversion of modern agricultural buildings, which this is. In addition, planning officers don't see this building as this proposed development as being a conversion. We do see the amount of work which would be needed to do to that building would be tantamount to a new build development in the open countryside. It would need a significant amount of work to make it into a functional building. Obviously, it's quite, if you go back to the photos, Phil, it's quite open. There isn't much structure to it in terms of substance. It is an open agricultural building, which, again, you can see across Monmouthshire. So the report is quite detailed in outlining the reasons as to why we feel that it is tantamount to a new build development in the open countryside, which would be contrary to policy LC1. There's no planning officers reviewed the exceptions element of policy T2. It does outline quite clearly that we would not accept the conversion of modern agricultural buildings. There is one exception within the policy which is dealt with within the report, referring to rural diversification. In this instance, we don't feel the application has supplied enough information and justification as to why we would allow these residential units to be constructed in the open countryside. There are other forms of rural diversification which the applicant could accommodate on the site, such as shepherd's huts and more sustainable forms of rural tourism, which could be accommodated on the site to provide a supplementary income to the farm. However, given the information that's presented before us, we don't feel there's enough justification and evidence for this scheme to be considered to be rural diversification. So for the report is quite detailed and provides clear rationale as to why we feel the principle of the development is unacceptable, because it's not a conversion and it would be tantamount to a new build development in the open countryside. Also, in considering the application, we've looked at the design and the proposed, if you go back to the proposed elevations, Phil, the overall design and the concept for the development, we feel, would be harmful to the rural countryside. It's quite a large structure. It's have the form of an agricultural building. It introduces an alien domestic paraphernalia onto this structure, and it would be quite out of keeping with the rural landscape. So we think that it would be harmful to the Wye Valley Area of Outstanding Natural Beauty. You also see in the late correspondence that Andrew Blake, the AONB officer, has also commented on the application and supports officer's recommendation and does feel that the development would be harmful to the AONB. So for the detailed rationale outlined within the report, we do feel that the proposed development is unacceptable in terms of the principle of the development and also on the design and character of the resultant building. So there are two reasons for refusal. Firstly, I'll read them out to you. The modern agricultural building is not appropriate for residential use. It requires substantial construction to accommodate the proposed tourism use. The principle of converting this modern utilitarian structure for residential use is unacceptable, and the development would result in unjustified new built development within the open countryside, contrary to policies T2, H4, criteria E, RE3 and LC1 of the Monmouthshire Local Development Plan. Second reason is the proposal would substantially alter the appearance of the building, and the resultant building would not be in keeping with other buildings in the countryside in the area. The development would introduce an incongruous hybrid building of an agricultural form and domestic appearance that would have an adverse impact on the character and appearance of the rural landscape, which is sensitively located within the Wye Valley Area of Outstanding Natural Beauty. The development is contrary to the objectives of policies DES 1C, EP1 and LC4 of the LDP, which seeks to protect the special quality and appearance of the rural landscape. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Glasson, would you like to take this down? You have 4 minutes, Mr. Glasson.
Thank you, Chair, for the opportunity to address the committee today. I'm David Glasson, representing Mr. and Mrs. Parry. Penterry Farm is no different to any other farm. It's been compelled to explore farm diversification simply in order to survive in the current economic climate. With increasing energy costs, lower food prices, and all the uncertainty of the UK's departure from the European Union, the additional revenue from holiday letting will support not only the core farm business, but it will have positive spin-offs for the surrounding rural economy as well. The farm is well placed, sitting as it does above Tintern Abbey, and likewise the Wye Valley and Forest of Dean. Tourism, as we know, is actively encouraged in Monmouthshire, and additional accommodation will unquestionably strengthen the area's appeal as a visitor destination. The barn in question is sandwiched between two dwellings and has not been used for agriculture for 10 years, due to the impact farming activities would have upon the amenities of these dwellings. It is described as of modern construction, but it actually dates back to the 1970s. It might not be attractive to look at, but it's in sound structural condition, means it's not going to disappear any day soon. Like any other barn conversion, the roof needs replacing, the walls need recladding, but this does not, I stress, does not amount to rebuilding or even new build, and it's really no different were the barn being upgraded to, say, a grain store. The proposed holiday lets are undeniably located on the farm, they will be managed by the farm, and they will be used to support the farm. The officers have not previously indicated that a detailed business case is needed, but if necessary, the applicants can provide one. Furthermore, the applicants are prepared to enter into a Section 106 agreement to ensure the accommodation remains part of the farm business and satisfies the officer's need for a stronger linkage. As the barn is of unremarkable appearance and makes no contribution to the AONB at present, we have attempted to instil some character into the design, but the windows in particular we accept could be revisited in an amendment to downplay any domestic pretensions. Likewise, parking could also be looked at again in favour of a more discreet location. The current building makes no contribution to the AONB at present, so there is an opportunity here to conserve and enhance, I stress enhance, the natural beauty in line with policy LC4. We are not looking to rebuild this barn, but it is noteworthy, as the officers have mentioned already, that policy T2 does actually allow for the substantial rebuild of a building within the curtilage of an existing and occupied farm property where it assists in agricultural diversification. The officers have attempted to split hairs by claiming the barn is on the holding but not within the curtilage of an occupied farm property, but this is rather disingenuous. As you have seen from your site visit, the barn is between two farm dwellings and is part of a long-established ribbon of farm development along the farm drive, so it is patently within the curtilage of occupied farm property. This barn has no future for agriculture, regrettably, but it does offer an ideal opportunity for the farm to diversify sustainably without adding any new buildings or covering the fields in yurts, teepees and tree houses. We would welcome the chance to work with officers to modify the scheme and provide the additional supporting evidence they require. In that vein, we would invite members today to defer a decision to allow further negotiations with your officers. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, and thank you very much for that, and thank you, Craig, for your report as well. I mean, this is in a very sensitive area, as members appreciated yesterday, a beautiful area in AONB and a special landscape environment. Thank you, members, for coming yesterday to the site. I really appreciate that, and as I'm sure the agent does as well. Is there any mileage in delaying this decision and perhaps looking back towards further diversification opportunities? I would like members to consider this, and also Craig, perhaps.
In terms of officers' recommendation, I don't think it is new build development in the open countryside. The policies are quite clear in terms of how we deal with this type of development, the conversion of modern agricultural buildings. I don't think there's anything that could be put in front of us that would change our minds on that in terms of the principles so strong and it's so embedded in national policy as well. Obviously, that would be something they could consider at appeal, and if that process is there for the applicants to go through. But as officers, we're clear that our recommendation is the correct recommendation to members.
Councillor Murphy.
Thank you, Chair. And yes, I agree with the officers here. I don't see how we can support this. It falls down on so many counts. If the application wants to come back with a fresh application based on diversification of farming activities, more than happy to look at that on its merits. But this isn't a conversion of a barn. This is an entirely different thing, as far as I'm concerned. It cuts across so many different policies. I don't see how we can support it. But if an application came forward for some form of supportable diversification, I would be more than happy to have a look at it.
Councillor Feakins.
Thank you, Chair, and very much in line with what Phil just said. And just to note also in Planning Policy Wales, the new Planning Policy Wales 10, it notes that AONB should be afforded the same rights of protection as national parks. And so I think it would be derogation of our duties to not hold that at the forefront of our minds.
Anybody else wish to speak? No.
Thank you, Chair. Just to point out that we've got hundreds of this sort of barn all over the county, and we would need to be very careful if we say yes to this one against officer advice for a start. And as I say, there are hundreds of them, and how would we resist hundreds of applications coming in? Thank you, Chair.
Right. Yes, David. Alan, sorry.
Move refusal of the application, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, that's seconded. Thank you, Councillor Murphy. Those in favour of refusing the application, please show. Okay, everybody. I'm abstaining as usual. So the application is lost. We now go to page 79, which is a full application for four affordable dwellings at Lantilio Cresceni. Andrew.
Yes, thank you, Chair. This is a full application, as you say, for the erection of 4 affordable dwellings in the village of Lantilio Cresceni. The site is to be considered as an affordable housing...
by all means, yeah. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Chair. So yes, this site is to be considered as an affordable housing rule exception under policy H7 of the LDP. The application is presented to members today due to concerns raised by the Council's highway engineer. So a number of the members in the room were on site yesterday. If we quickly look through the site photographs. This is a view to the east looking at the vicarage. That's a view to the south. Also the vicarage still yeah. Some local wildlife as well. This is a view to look into the west. And finally, Phil, that's just confirming the extent of the site location edged in red. So the site itself measures approximately 0.16 hectares of arable land. And so as you can see, it's sort of broadly rectangular in shape, is also within the Lantilio Cresceni Conservation Area. Would just note, linking back to a previous application, the site is, in this instance, entirely outside of the C2 flood zone. So the proposal is for 4 affordable units, which would be provided by a pair of semi-detached properties. To confirm from site yesterday as well that these would be 3 2-bed dwellings and 1 3-bed dwelling. Vehicle access would be provided from the north, so you can see on screen there's 2 points of access there leading to turn-in and parking facilities. The layout would meet adopted parking standards per bedroom. However, visitor parking would be provided in the lay-by, which perhaps Phil, if you can point out, in that area there. So the dwellings themselves would be 2-storey and finished, and we've had confirmation from Monmouthshire Housing Association in smooth render with fibre cement roof tiles. So, as you can see on the elevational drawings there. So in terms of officers' considerations, there are, again, a number of material considerations. Firstly, with regard to principle, as set out earlier, policy H7 of the LTP gives favourable consideration to the site of small, affordable housing sites in rural areas adjoining rural secondary settlements, main and minor villages, as identified in policy S1. This is subject to the following criteria, the first of which is that there is genuine local need. The Council's housing officer has confirmed that there are 43 households on our housing register with a local connection to Lantilio United. The second criteria is that where a registered social landlord is not involved, there is a clear arrangement that the benefits of affordable housing would be secured. However, in this instance, the application would be delivered by an RSL in Monmouthshire Housing Association. The final criteria then is that the proposal would have no significant adverse impact on the village form and character of surrounding area or create additional traffic or access problems. So I'll just come on to those points now. In terms of the visual impact, and in particular on the Lantilio Cresceni Conservation Area, in the Conservation Area appraisal, the settlement is described as being a dispersed settlement dominated by the landmark church. The units themselves have been designed to appear as 2 larger detached dwellings, as it is considered this to be more appropriate in keeping within the wider settlement pattern, as opposed to 4 smaller individual buildings. There's a mix of materials within the village. Most of the historic buildings feature sandstone rubble, and also notably there's Hostry House, which is painted white render. The vicarage next door to the application site, as you'll see, is slightly distinguished by its use of red brick. But however, the proposal has been considered by the Council's Heritage Officer, who has advised that the proposal would not cause unacceptable harm to the character of the village or the identified conservation area. With regard to highways, as noted, some concerns have been raised by the Council's engineer. However, access to the unnamed highway to the north is not considered to give rise to unacceptable increase in trip generation. Having regard to PPW10 and sort of sustainable hierarchy of transport, it noted that the site is not well served by public services and amenities. However, for the reasons detailed previously, there is clear demonstrable need for local affordable housing, and this is considered to outweigh that. So as noted, the scheme would deliver 1 parking space per bedroom. However, the council's highways engineer has raised some concern with the provision of visitor parking being provided in the lay-by that was shown earlier. However, given the likely traffic lane that the site would be accessed, there is not considered to be unacceptable harm, and this is also preferable to providing larger areas of hard standing within the front of the properties, especially given the edge of rural settlement location. With regards to residential amenity, the nearest neighbour would be, as we've seen on the photographs, to the east, the vicarage. No windows would be sited on the east elevation of plot 1, which has actually been moved away further from the boundary through negotiation with the case officer and the applicant. This would also enable the retention of a small group of trees on the boundary. Whilst no first floor windows would exist on the side elevation, there would be a window on the rear elevation, but perhaps you can see from the layout, given the orientation, this is not considered. Oh, if you just go to the layout. Next one. Next site layout. Sorry. So yes, there would be a first floor rear window on plot 1, sort of southerly point, but say given the orientation with the neighbouring property, it's not considered this would cause unacceptable harm to privacy. With regards to biodiversity, the scheme has been considered in detail by the Council's Biodiversity Entry Officer. You'll note in the officer's report there's a detailed impact with regards to protected species. A 6-metre section of hedgerow would be lost to accommodate the access arrangements. However, a new green buffer zone would be incorporated to the south and west boundaries. And it's also worth noting that this would be outside of private ownership and managed by Monmouthshire Housing Association, which should ensure its long-term integrity and survival. Therefore, it's considered, in conclusion, that this provides much-needed local affordable housing, and for the conditions set out in the officer's report, is recommended to members today for approval.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. Hold on a minute. Councillor Powell.
Thank you. Councillor Ruth Edwards rang me up before lunch and asked me to speak on her behalf. She wants to say she's sorry she's not here today, but she has undergone major operation and she would not be able to be here. But she just wanted to pass on her opinion that she's very much in favour of this proposal. Thank you.
Thank you. Right, who have we got next? Dave. Councillor Dovey.
Other than just mentioning the gable ends, perhaps we could have some gable ends just to make sure that you feel well about things. Chairman, I recommend that we acceptance of this. I think it would be a good facility in the place. It's needed. We should go for it.
Yeah, thank you, David. We've had confirmation from the client, from the applicant, that the fascias, the barges, will all have 150 mil normal dimension. Came through this morning.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I think when we're on site, I mentioned the idea of having a soft render as opposed to the rough render, and I don't think there was any objection voiced by the applicant to that particular idea. And it does seem a good scheme to me with affordable housing. The only question I've got is about the visibility displays, because there was a question about it only being on one particular side rather than the other in the highways report, and I just wondered how that would be looked at. Thanks.
Andrew, do you want to answer that?
Jeff, if I can just come back to that point on the visibility displays.
Yeah.
Just to confirm Councillor Brown's other point with regards to the render, as confirmed in the presentation, it would be smooth render as discussed on site yesterday.
Okay. Councillor Higginson?
Oh, Councillor Dovey dealt with mine. He beat me to the pull.
Oh, okay. Whoops, Councillor Feekins?
Thank you, Chair. A really good scheme. A delight to see before us and I would second David's approval.
Murphy?
Yeah, it absolutely fits with the criteria of the overwhelming need to provide affordable housing in the countryside. So if you want to put it to a vote, Chair, I think we would all know what we were going to do.
All those in favour, please show. Thank you. We now move on to erection of 2 bedrooms in Port Skewett, sorry, 2 bedrooms, 2 semi-detached houses in Port Skewett on page 101. Councillor Craig O'Connor. Mr O'Connor, please.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, this application is for the erection of 2 two-bedroom semi-detached houses on 72 The Close, Port Skewett. This aerial photograph shows the site outlined in red. The site is actually 2 gardens for 71 and 72 The Close, Port Skewett. So it's actually 2 gardens separately, and this application covers both sites. If you go to the next. So this is the photographs of members who were on site yesterday of The Close, which shows the property 72 The Close there, which is a terrace property. Again, shows looking from the road, looking at the boundary treatment of the fence, which shows the site. Again, Philip, this was the next photo. These are just photographs of the street scene, different properties in the area. There is a mix. This is a proposed block plan which shows the proposed 2-bedroom dwellings on the site in relation to the existing property. It shows the parking provision at the front, so it's providing 2 parking spaces per dwelling, which is in accordance with Monmouthshire's parking guidance. This is the proposed elevation, so you can see they're 2.5-storey dwellings with a ridge height of approximately 7.3 metres, which is slightly lower than the adjacent property. This is a picture elevation from the side, which shows the relationship with the existing property. And these are the proposed plans, which show the layout. So that there's living accommodation on the ground floor, and then 1 bedroom and bathroom on the first floor, and then the 2nd bedroom with ensuite bathroom in the roof. So the site is located within Port Skewett and within settlement boundary, so the principle of development is acceptable subject to material planning considerations. Officers have reviewed the design and scale of the developments, and on balance are of the opinion that the proposed scale and design of the dwellings is acceptable given the mix and variety in the street scene. They also considered the implications on the highway, which was concerns raised by Port Skewett Community Council. However, as outlined within the report, the parking provision for this particular site is considered to be acceptable. Highways have been consulted on the application, have no objections with regards to the proposed access arrangements and the parking provisions. So in terms of highway safety, the proposed development is considered to be acceptable, as it wouldn't have any harmful impact on the street scene. In terms of residential amenity, the proposed dwellings wouldn't have an unacceptable impact on anybody's privacy. There's no overlooking windows, and the proposed development isn't considered to be unacceptably overbearing or dominant. And the objections received do not relate to the design, scale and mass of the proposed development. The objections relate to the highway safety. So the application is recommended to members with a recommendation for approval, subject to the applicants signing a Section 106 legal agreement for a committed sum of £19,964 towards affordable housing. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Murphy.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I've got a statement here from Councillor Peter Fox, who's the local member, who can't be here today. Unfortunately, his mother has recently died, and he's dealing with matters associated with that. So to read out his submission, as County Councillor for Portskewett, I have serious concerns about this application and totally disapprove of what's being proposed. Predominantly, my concerns surround the safety of pedestrians, which would include many children and elderly, many of which use the recreation hall, play area and other community areas that are accessed via the adjacent lane, which is immediately next to the proposed site, and it's that lane on the eastern side there. These facilities are well used, and as such the lane can be busy at regular times with vehicles and pedestrians. I also have concerns about the additional property entrances and the additional vehicular movements that will enter and leave the highway at what is a bottleneck at the entrance of the close, and the additional estates of St Mary's Place and Southbrook View. This short stretch of busy road has seen several accidents over the years and is known locally as an area of great concern. The approval of additional dwellings and the vehicles associated with these will, in my view, cause a serious worsening of the current problems we see at that point. Whilst in theory the proposed site may look like it can accommodate a dwelling, its position is totally inappropriate and will add nothing but danger to our community. So that's the end of Councillor Fox's statement.
Thank you. Could we just go back to the elevations, please? As an observation, you've got 3 floors going in here to the space that's got 2 floors. It doesn't look anything like anything else around it, and it'd be so much easier to develop this piece of ground with one more property which matches up and looks like what's there already. Why stick a carbuncle on a small spot that it won't take? That's my view.
Sorry, this year. Yeah, I totally agree with the comments that you made. I mean, if there was one house there, it wouldn't be a problem. But the way that is, and it's right up to the boundary, and I don't think it's acceptable. And you mentioned it's totally out of context with what's already there.
Anybody else wish to add to it? Then I'll move from the chair that we refuse this application on overdevelopment from this. Is it seconded? Councillor Peters.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
I second that.
All those in favour of refusal?
Well, normally you would defer the application,
yes,
but officers could prepare reasons for refusal. Yeah, they'll bring it back. They bring it back next year. Bring it back next year.
Okay, all those for refusal, please show. That's everybody. Well done.
Chair, just to make sure we're clear then before we bring it back next time, you were talking about overdevelopments and the design in the street scene, yeah? There were comments made from Councillor Fox about highways. There's no objection from highways. That wasn't mentioned during the debate, to my knowledge. Are you content on that aspect?
I think if we only had one.
On that, having visited the site, it is a no-through road. Therefore, almost by definition, everyone using that road will know what the problems are. They'll see how bendy it is, and how many children are using it, and theoretically, I suppose, should be taking that into account. I don't think we have a problem highways-wise. I agree with what highways say.
Sorry, Jay, I just wanted to give members a bit of history to the site as well. In terms of, it actually came in sort of 2 4-bedroom houses to start off with, and also the applicant has been advised that one dwelling might potentially be more acceptable. So there is a bit of history to it, but they do want this application determined on its merits. So the reasons that you've outlined, obviously we can come back and defer that to next month if you do consider.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. If I could just come back on the highways aspect. Yeah, I can see why highways officers think it's all right, because it's on that junction. There's a wide bit of road, sort of to the east of it. But the way that the on-street parking is in that area, and the fact that it's a very well-trafficked area because of the substantial amount of activity that goes on behind this development with the village hall and the cornfields project and the play area and everything else, I can see why there would be a danger there in traffic movements. The existing traffic movements flow. There they wouldn't be, and you'd have vehicles reversing in and out of that particular site at an area where there's congestion anyway. So I think there is a problem with highways.
Jim?
Just quickly, Chairman, it's also a double bend there,
Yeah.
right by there.
Okay, are you all still mindful to refuse it on that basis? Okay, nobody for it? No. Okay, John?
Sorry, Chair, I'm unclear. Is highways a reason for refusal or not? Shall I suggest we present it back to you at the next meeting with the reasons around O development and design, and if you're minded to add another one then, and you're happy you can substantiate that at appeal then so be it. Okay, thanks.
Chair, can I ask that highways officers give a bit of thought to the actual use of that bit of road and in that context?
When we went there with the delegated panel originally, it was actually quite a dangerous place to stand. We had to stand on the pavement. There were cars coming quite quickly, bound round both directions. So it has got its highway problems, that stretch of road.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Yeah. One final thought, Chair. I think a number of us on the committee have indicated that we would like to see the officers talking to the applicant about one dwelling. Not that we don't want to see anything there altogether. That's just my take on it. And that's what I'd like to see there. Sensible plans coming back for one dwelling.
Well, we have one application left this afternoon on page 117. It's application number 00142. It's only here because it's one of our own. Would somebody like to move it? Is anybody against it? No, then it's moved. Thank you very much, everybody. Mark, do you wish to say anything before the end of the meeting?
Chair, two things. There's an appeal decision on the agenda that members will have seen relating to Kai Story Avenue in Raglan, which is an appeal that was lost, but the decisions are there in the agenda. We also want to cover the infill SPG, seek Planning Committee's comments before it goes out to consultation. And last but not least, I've emailed you about an additional meeting on the 19th of March, 10 a.m., where we'll reconsider the Raglan application and probably a couple of other things on the agenda. In terms of the SPG, Chair, are you happy to take that now? Okay, if Dave wants to come down and introduce the topic. Chair, while Dave's coming down, I think Councillor Brown's got a question.
I just wondered when we were going to discuss the appeals. Well, yeah. Well, I wanted to make a comment on one of them.
You carry on.
Well, it was in relation to the one in Ragland. If you have a look at paragraph 7 of the decision and also paragraph 7 of the cost decision, paragraph 7 of the decision says the houses closest to the site on Kestori Avenue are two-storey semi-detached dwellings with render-painted walls and which, save for some minor alterations, have retained their original uniformity of appearance. And then in relation to the cost decision, again at paragraph 7, he talks it's talked about basically it being a subjective decision based on character and appearance. Well, taking those two things into account, I can't see how, in view of it being a subjective judgment by the committee, I can't see how it's an unreasonable judgment, which is the basis of how costs are awarded. And I wondered whether the committee wanted to consider expressing concerns to the inspectorate, quoting from those two paragraph 7s that are there, first of all in relation to the decision, because on paragraph 7 he says the reasons actually why we put forward because of the uniformity of appearance. And then there was the however afterwards in that paragraph. But if you took off the however, then the reasons that the committee made the decision were actually within the inspector's report. And then on the paragraph 7, he said he admits that it's a subjective judgment and then allows costs on the basis that the council committee are being unreasonable. Now, I don't think those two things add up properly. So from that point of view, okay, thank you.
Mark.
Yeah, I had a bit of a discussion with Councillor Brown about this yesterday, so I can see the point that she's making. It's unusual for cost awards to come in, so it's up to members really. If they think this particular case is sufficient to warrant us writing to the planning inspectorate, then if that's your wish, I'm willing to do it. Alternatively, if you think it's rare and you want to monitor the situation, then equally it's up to you. But if your wish is that I write, then I'll do so.
Microphone on.
Microphone, David.
I thought the meeting result I go with Councillor Brown. I think we should get what we can out of this. I think I think the whole thing. Well, we had a conversation about it yesterday in the bus, and I just feel that the outcome is a travesty, and even the legalities of it I question. I think it's wrong.
Is it your general wish? Can you all show whether you would like Mark to write to the inspectorate about the outcome on this particular application, both to the decision and the cost award? So you, obviously you, 4 of you. 1, 2, 3, 4. You, Roger? 5.
Yeah.
Anybody? 6 with Jim. Will you write, please? Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we'll do, Chair.
Thank you, Chair. Hi, Prananda. I'm David Wong. I am a senior planning policy officer. Some time ago, there was a suggestion by planning committee that it would be useful to have additional guidance in place to help shape proposal for small-scale residential infill development in the county's designated settlements. As a result of that suggestion, we have produced this draft supplementary planning guidance for infill development, which provides detailed matters that needs to be taken into account when considering proposal for small-scale infill development. In this instance, small-scale means any proposals that have less than 10 dwellings. Also, when referring to the county's designated settlements, we mean all of the settlements as defined under policy S1, H1, H2, and H3 of the LDP. For example, the main towns, 7-side settlements, rural secondary settlements, main villages, and minor villages. Appendix A of the draft SPG set out all of the relevant settlements if you need more information. You will note that this draft document, excluding the appendix, is less than 20 pages. We wanted this to be an easy read design guide, and of course, it would be impossible for this SPG to cover every situation, as every road, every settlement, towns, or the countryside in the county has a different appearance or character. However, this SPG does set out the key matters that the council would normally take into consideration when determining an infill development planning application. For example, we talk about site context, like the plot size, garden size, orientation, the general design of the area. We need to take into account of privacy, amenity, for example, distances between habitable bedroom windows, parking standards, visibility displays, preserving good quality trees, ecology, drainage, and of course, affordable housing financial contributions is another key matter that needs to be considered. Thank you, Chair. So at the moment, this draft SPG carries very little weight in the consideration of planning applications. For SPG to be given weight, appropriate consultation needs to be undertaken. Therefore, the purpose of today's presentation is to seek your endorsement of the draft infill development SPG with a view to issuing for consultation. Please note that there are 3 options available before you, and they are set out in section 5 of this committee report agenda. The first option is for you to endorse this draft SPG for consultation. That means we will keep this document as it is, and then we will notify those considered to have an interest in this SPG, such as local agents or all of the town and community councils. We will also use our social media accounts, such as Twitter, for wider consultation. The second option is to endorse this draft SPG for consultation with amendments. That means you will give me amendments today, and then I will go back and make adjustment to the document, and then representing it back to Planning Committee for another endorsement with a view to issuing for consultation. But we feel this option is unnecessary, as all of the comments received during the consultation will be analyzed, and the documents will be amended as appropriate prior to report back for members' consideration to seek a resolution to adopt the SPG. And the third option is to do nothing. I used to completely forget about this, having any guidance for the consideration of any future infill development planning applications. However, this option, by choosing this option, it does not address Planning Committee's request for this guidance. Therefore, I want to highlight to you that option 1 is our preferred option, which is to endorse this draft SPG for consultation. Thank you, Chair. The floor is yours.
Thank you, David. Yep, Louise.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I've had a look at this draft policy, and I do think it's, you know, my first comments are, I think it's very good, and I think, you know, it's certainly better than what we've got at the moment. The only, however, that I would like to put in is just in relation to, I think it covers infill development better than it covers backland development, you know, in the back of the garden. And I think in view of the application that we've recently had an appeal on that, I think that area could be strengthened and to make it clear, because it's not always quite clear which is backland and which is infill that you're referring to in the document. And you've got those very useful diagrams with ticks and crosses. Well, it would be useful if we also had a ticks and crosses diagram in relation to backland development, you know, so that we could say that, in a sense, backland development also had, you know, a similar sort of height and form as the front street scene, which is the problem that we had in the Raglan development, because of the fact that, you know, it was said it didn't affect the front scene, but it was part and parcel of the neighbouring properties. The second area that I would like to see would be some definition of neighbouring properties, because I consider neighbouring properties actually your surrounding properties as a whole, as opposed to going across the whole of the street or round the corner or at the back end. And the back end is very important in relation to obviously backland development, because you know you're actually physically closer to the other end. The other point I would...
That's 2, 3 have we got?
Yeah, the other one I would like to see an amendment is you did put a limit on minor villages. I'd like to see the same limit on main villages, and also you didn't append SAH11, which I think is a sense should have been appended. But you know, those are the general comments. So I would prefer option 2, actually, Chairman.
All right. Okay. Thank you. Matthew?
Thank you, Chair. Did anyone want to respond to those first? No.
No, we're going to do it all at the end.
Okay, cool. I'm happy to go out to public consultation as it is. I think they're more capable than us, or as capable as us, and that the sooner we open it up to that wider discussion, the better it will be. The only thing I would say is that what we ought to consider, we are considering within our processes the point in technical terms of allowing houses outside of the LDP to be paying a affordable housing contribution at a set level of 35% or 25%, wherever it is in the county, and that's unarguable, unquestionable, and is not subject to viability. There's nothing stopping us having that same policy interior as well. We've got SUDS coming along. SUDS will again hit at and eat away at viability of sites. My thinking is if there's justification for housing or going on the outside of towns where they have to adhere to the preset level of affordable housing provision, that we should be making that same application to the interior of towns as well, notwithstanding obviously about densities and other wider policies about bringing that in. But there's a point there that we could introduce that would allow us to make sure we always get that 35% or 25%, and that it isn't subject to viability, which it is at the moment, and it's being eroded, and that's been a contention in this committee for a while.
Yeah, okay. Philip?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think we should go with option 1. Section 5, the site context, deals with what should go where. I think that deals with the backland point. I'd like to hear what the agents have got to say. So I'd be happy to go with option 1.
Yeah, Councillor Dovey.
Just a very short one, Chairman. I think the point that Councillor Brown made over neighbouring and neighbourhood policies is a very good point, because it does enable you to have a framework of design that has a style, if you like, with it, without them being boring. So you can it allows developers to be creative in what they will want to put in front of us. That's all. I'm not a financial man. Somebody else must think about that.
David, you picked up what Councillor Brown said, haven't you? So you picked those points up. So you can take that as part of process number 1 anyway. Yeah. Mark?
Yeah, Chair, I was just going to comment. We picked up on those points, as David's just confirmed. We can certainly look in terms of diagrams, a bit more clarity around backlands. I think, yeah, we can look at the wording during the consultation period as well to be clear about whether we're talking about surrounding properties or immediately adjacent neighbouring properties. The issue in terms of backland is an interesting one, because appeal decisions will consistently look at the visibility from the street scene. So there'll be issues around perhaps the scale and the impact on a neighbouring house. But if you can't particularly see it from that street scene of properties, there'll be less concerns in terms of it being identical. The last thing I was going to mention in terms of viability, there's separate SPG being worked on in terms of commuted sums for small sites. We can't introduce via this a policy that says we're not negotiating on stuff within settlement boundary. It's in the LDP and national planning policy that viability discussions happen. We've got that stance on unallocated sites because that's part of our negotiating power, if you like. But the LDP policy on housing is clear that viability is a legitimate thing that we have to look at. So we can't do that part, I'm afraid. In terms of kind of limits on house numbers or similar, we've deliberately kept it in terms of referring to fewer than 10 dwellings for that smaller scale, but we haven't sought to add any other controls on different settlement sizes because we just need to assess each cap as it comes up, each site as it comes up, on how big the gap is. The only exception to that being the very small infill on villages without a settlement boundary, and that comes straight from the LDP policy. So I guess just in the context to clarify, SPG is to clarify and build on an LDP policy. We can't invent new policy directly. Thanks.
Louise, you want to wind up?
Yeah, I mean, I personally think it's important. It is an important policy, and I think it's important to try and, I mean, even if it's only a few tweaks here and there, I think it's important to get those little bits clarified before it goes out for consultation, because the problem is if you then alter it afterwards, then you've got the issue of, you know, does it need to be consulted on how different is it actually. And I think, you know, from that point of view, I think it's more important to, you know, be fully happy with the document that goes out rather than say, oh, yes, let's get it done. And, you know, I think, as I said, I do think it's a very good document, but I do think it needs a few tweaks here and there. And I think it will be preferable, because then you do reach the decision. If you do make tweaks afterwards, then you're going to have problems of saying, do we need to reconsult because of that? Thank you.
Surely, Chair, that any amendments be on the basis of the consultation. So that's the whole point of it. I mean, otherwise, you'd never make a decision about anything. You constantly be reconsulting on what you've reconsulted on.
It's the first time we've seen the draft.
I think the officers have got it. Okay, everybody happy? That brings the